Hey guys, tonight we're going behind some of the most famous paintings in history, and what we'll find is not what you'd expect. There's a young woman lying in a bathtub of cold water in a London studio, holding perfectly still, while the painter forgets to check if the lamps underneath have gone out. There's a teenage girl from a Chelsea slum whose new employer has drawn up a list of which men are allowed to look at her. And there's a former prostitute who threw a nutshell at a stranger's head and never apologised for a single thing about herself. These are the women behind the Pre-Raphaelite paintings, the models who held the poses, wore the borrowed costumes, and earned a shilling an hour standing still in rooms that smelled of turpentine. Tonight we'll sit with them in those rooms and find out what it felt like to be the woman inside the painting. Now settle in. Find the spot where your body feels heavy enough to stay. If these slow evenings help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe so another one's waiting when you need it. And if you feel like telling me where you're listening from tonight, I'd love to know. Alright, let's begin. In the winter of 1849, a young painter named Walter Deverell needed a girl with red hair. That was all. Not a beauty, not a muse, not a soulmate. He was deep into a big canvas drawn from a moment in Twelfth Night, and he needed someone who could pass for a young man in costume. Someone with the right colouring, the right bones in her face. He'd already used his own reflection for Orsino, and persuaded Gabriel Rossetti to sit for Feste, but the part of Viola disguised as Cesario still had nobody standing in its place. So he was looking, and the thing about looking, in Victorian London, was that you couldn't just walk up to a young woman on the street and ask her. Not if she was respectable, not if you wanted her to say yes. Walter was 22 years old, giving classes a few days a week at the Government School of Design, and spending every spare hour in front of his canvas. He was good-looking in a soft, almost girlish way, which is perhaps why he'd cast himself as Orsino. He had a mother, Mrs. Deverell, who could be deployed as a kind of chaperone by proxy, a respectable lady whose presence turned an improper proposition into a polite request. So one afternoon, the story goes, he brought her along to a bonnet maker's workshop in Cranbourne Alley, a narrow lane running off Leicester Square. It was a cramped passage, the kind of place where bonnet shops and small workshops pressed up against each other, where the air smelled of sizing and ribbon dye, and the light came in thin and grey from above. And somewhere in that shop, behind the counter, or bent over a workbench in a back room, Walter spotted a young woman with auburn hair. She was tall, with a long pale throat, and a way of holding herself that looked, to a painter's eye, like it might work on canvas. Her name was Elizabeth Siddal, though almost nobody ever called her that. She was Lizzie. Walter didn't speak to her, couldn't. A young man approaching a young woman he didn't know in her place of work to ask her to come to his rooms and let him look at her. That was, in the language of the time, a sexual proposition. It didn't matter what you actually wanted because the act of asking was enough, so instead he asked his mother to do it. Mrs. Deverell went up to the milliner, not to Lizzie herself, and asked whether the shop's assistant might be permitted to sit for her son. There was no need, apparently, to ask the assistant what she thought about it. Permission was granted, and just like that, a young woman who'd been trimming bonnets for a living stepped into a world she hadn't known existed. There's another version of this story, and it's less tidy. It says the first person to find Lizzie wasn't a painter at all, but a poet named William Allingham, an Irishman who, when he was in London, liked to flirt with shop girls and actresses between visits to literary salons. Allingham had been chatting up several of the milliners along Cranbourne Alley, including a girl named Ellen Britton who shared a counter with Lizzie at the bonnet shop. When Walter happened to mention he needed a model with red hair, Allingham said he knew just the place. This version is messier, less romantic, and probably closer to the truth. It came through a chain of hearsay, from Allingham to his much younger wife Helen, from Helen to a writer named Violet Hunt, so we can't be sure. But its point is sharp. Allingham, who had an eye for pretty girls, didn't think Lizzie was worth pursuing. After her death, before her fame, he wrote that her pallor, that mass of red hair, her narrow frame, all of it struck him as strange, even moving, but not once, he said, did he consider her beautiful. And that's the thing that keeps snagging at me. Everything we think we know about Lizzie Siddal, the ethereal beauty, the tragic muse, the face that launched 100 paintings, was built backwards. The legend came first, and then the memories rearranged themselves to fit it. By the time anyone sat down to write about how she was found, she was already famous, already dead, already wrapped in so many layers of myth that the original girl in the bonnet shop had disappeared entirely. William Michael Rossetti, Gabriel's brother and the self-appointed chronicler of the whole Pre-Raphaelite circle, claimed she'd been roughly 16 when Deverell found her. In reality, she was past 20, but he said she was ladylike, that she committed no faults of speech, that she had a kind of instinctive refinement. Holman Hunt, always competing for the best version of every story, wrote his own account years later, and had Walter rushing into the room crying out that he'd stumbled upon the most astonishing creature. Tall as a queen, he supposedly said, with features of extraordinary delicacy and refinement. The language piles up like theatre curtains. But Walter wasn't looking for a queen. He was looking for a girl who could pass for a boy. And red hair in 1849 was not beautiful. It was strange and unfashionable, associated with Judas Iscariot, with baseness and betrayal. A homely character in a well-known novel of the period was dismissed in 3 words: red-haired, freckled, and destined never to become anybody's heroine. That was the hair colour Walter wanted, not because it was lovely, but because it was odd. Lizzie's family, the Siddalls, had their own quiet mythology. Her niece would later claim that Hope Hall in Sheffield should rightfully have been inherited by Lizzie's grandfather, and her sister Lydia was always intensely proud of the family name. There were whispers of a coat of arms, of genteel origins lost somewhere in the long slide from South Yorkshire craftsmen to London shopkeepers. In truth, her grandfather had gone into the scissors trade back in the 1780s, and her father Charles was a cutler, a skilled tradesman who made and repaired knives and sold them from the front room of his shop. It was honest, respectable, careful work, the kind that gave you calloused hands and a clean collar, and a place in the world that was neither high nor low, but somewhere in the anxious middle, where you could fall if the trade turned bad and rise if it didn't. By the time Lizzie was born in 1829, the family had moved from Sheffield to London and had settled in a street near Hatton Garden, a neighbourhood of small trades and watchmakers, and the particular kind of respectability that depends on no one looking too closely. So when Lizzie stepped out of the bonnet shop and into Walter Deverell's studio, the distance she was crossing wasn't as vast as the legend later made it seem. She wasn't a barefoot waif, but a tradesman's daughter who'd been apprenticed to a milliner at 13 and had spent the better part of 7 years learning how to trim bonnets and handle ribbon and read the season's moods. The gap between her world and the painter's world was real, but it was a gap of manner, not of miles. The painters were also sons of the anxious middle. Hunt's people told a similar story of better days behind them, and the Rossettis were propping up their father's reputation even as the household sank. Everyone in this story was pretending to be slightly grander than they were. Lizzie just happened to be the one whose pretending mattered most. But here, before we leave the bonnet shop, there's something worth sitting with. The world Lizzie was stepping out of. The bonnet trade sat squarely inside the fashion world, and it carried real weight. It sat at the upper end of the garment trades, above seamstress work, above plain dressmaking. It demanded dexterity, an eye for colour, a feel for what the season wanted. A freshly dressed bonnet signalled that its wearer knew what the moment demanded. The latest looks crossed the channel from Paris every few months, and it fell to the milliners to interpret those designs for the women who couldn't afford the originals. In London alone, roughly 20,000 women worked in the needle and bonnet trades. Most girls entered the trade at about 13 and spent the next 5 years working their way up, starting as raw beginners, then graduating to what the trade called improvers. The hours were long during the season, Easter through July and again from October to Christmas and slack in between. It was sought-after work, considered clean and genteel, the kind of trade a poor clergyman's daughter might take up without disgrace, but it also had a reputation, and the reputation was unfair but sticky. Among men, milliners were suspected of looseness, and the logic, if you can call it that, went like this. Young women who worked in fashion must be vain women must be flirtatious women must be available. It didn't help that milliners had a degree of independence. They weren't under a master's roof. They dressed well for the shop, and they were seen and approached by young men on their way to and from work. Arthur Munby, who spent decades observing London's working women with an attention that lived somewhere between sociology and obsession, noted that a milliner he knew complained the other girls talked chiefly about their gentleman friends who gave them presents and took them to casinos. But Munby also understood that what counted as decent behaviour depended entirely on which rung of society you occupied. That the standards applied to a working girl and the standards applied to a lady were two entirely different sets of rules, drawn up by the same people who benefited from the difference. Lizzie, by all accounts, was not the flirtatious type, but she was 20 years old, working daily in central London, and she couldn't have been the innocent, passive creature the legend required. She'd walked those streets, heard those conversations, and when the offer came, 1 shilling an hour, limited hours, better money than trimming ribbons, she said yes. Not because she'd been swept off her feet, but because it was a better job. What I can't stop wondering about is the feel of that first sitting. Not the grand narrative of discovery, but the physical fact of it. Lizzie went to Deverell's studio, probably in those slack winter weeks between the Christmas rush and the Easter season, when the bonnet trade went quiet and a few days' modelling work was simply practical. She posed on a wooden bench, turned to one side, her body tilted forward and her fingers laced together, face showing only its edge. That reddish hair was swept back from her brow. She wore a costume, a tunic that ended above the knee, billowing at the arms paired with stockings, the kind of outfit that a mid-Victorian painter thought looked vaguely medieval. In the finished oil, he'd changed the outfit to a brief red tunic with loose panels where the sleeves should have been, mismatched stockings, one white, one pink, and comically pointed shoes. None of it would have been comfortable, and none of it would have been familiar. Young women in 1850 did not show their legs, not in public, not in private, not to anyone except a husband they didn't have yet. William Michael Rossetti, when he reviewed the finished work, complained stiffly that the outfit was too theatrical, too flimsy, that the shortness of the skirt surely couldn't have been intentional. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added that the model's face lacked the physical beauty the role of Viola required. So there it is. Her first sitting, and already the two things that would define Lizzie's life in these rooms were in place. She was wearing something that embarrassed her, and someone was noting in writing that she wasn't quite pretty enough. That's one discovery. The other happened a few miles west, and it had no bonnet shop, no mother, no polite request through a third party. It started in a slum. Holman Hunt's studio sat at number 5 Prospect Place on Cheyne Walk in Chelsea, facing the Thames. But directly behind those handsome houses, tucked into the yards and alleys off Justice Walk, the neighbourhood fell to pieces. The streets were narrow and damp and dark even at midday. Whole families lived in rooms that a gentleman would have thought too small for storing trunks. And in one of those courtyards, Crosskeys Court, named for the public house it crouched behind, a girl named Annie Miller was growing up. She'd been born around 1835 and her mother had died when she was still a baby. For roughly a decade, she and her elder sister Harriet stayed with their father, an old soldier who made a thin living hauling loads for a builder along the King's Road. A neighbour who'd watched the girls, whose own children they sometimes helped to mind, described them with the blunt compassion of the poor, unwashed, crawling with lice. Annie's hair, especially, was a tangled, matted thing nobody had thought to comb. When their father's health failed, he was admitted as a pensioner to the Royal Hospital, and the girls were sent to live with an uncle who mended shoes and an aunt who took in washing, people so poor themselves that their firstborn had come into the world inside a workhouse. Home was behind the public house, in the yard. This was the ground Annie stood on. Not the ground of a fairy tale, but the ground of something harder, closer to the bone. Hunt saw her in the streets around his studio. She was 15, maybe 16, and whether he noticed her first because of her looks or because of the kind of poverty she wore. The unwashed hair, the coarse language he later described, the reality that nobody stopped her wandering the neighbourhood at all hours, isn't clear. He didn't approach her right away. He was occupied with another model, a sturdy, pink-cheeked girl from the country called Emma Watkins, who'd travelled up from Kingston to sit for the hireling shepherd. Emma posed reclining in a meadow with a man leaning over her, and the painting's frank sensuality made Hunt's friends giddy. They dropped by the studio just to watch. They nicknamed her the Coptic for reasons nobody can explain anymore, and they banged on the studio door pretending to be her furious sailor sweetheart, threatening to thrash the artist who'd stolen his sweetheart. The laughter tells you something about those rooms. These were young men in their 20s, living on ambition and cheap lodgings, and the presence of a pretty working-class girl was, for all their talk about artistic truth, a source of amusement they couldn't quite resist. But Emma went back to Kingston, and Hunt turned to his next painting, The Awakening Conscience, a picture of a kept woman in her lover's rooms, caught in a sudden flash of moral clarity. He needed a new model, and there was Annie right outside his door. I think about this difference a lot. Lizzie was found in a shop, Annie in a courtyard. Lizzie's discovery had a fairy tale shape to it, even if the fairy tale was invented after the fact. The beauty hidden behind the counter, spotted by a discerning eye. Annie's discovery had none of that softness. Hunt didn't look at her and think, "There's my muse." He looked at her and thought, "There's someone who needs saving, or perhaps there's someone I can save." And those aren't the same thing at all. He wrote to her father, asking permission to employ her as a model. No reply ever came, and Hunt took this silence as proof that if he didn't act, Annie would end up in the clutches of whatever man came along first. It's a breathtaking piece of reasoning. A man who'd recently been prowling the streets looking at fallen women for artistic reference, who would later rent a room in St. John's Wood and furnish it with bright, vulgar, brand new furniture to get the setting right for his painting of a kept woman. This man believed, without visible irony, that he was the rescuer in the story. Annie sat for the painting in the autumn of 1853, dressed in something that looked like a soft cotton nightdress trimmed with whitework embroidery at the hem, a patterned shawl knotted low around her waist, her hair left to fall unbound. The picture was meant to be about sin and redemption. But the real scene was simpler and stranger than any allegory. A girl from Crosskeys Court was standing in a rented room, wearing a nightgown that wasn't hers, while a man she barely knew decided what her face should mean. Two discoveries, one dressed up in legend, the other in charity. Neither woman had been asked what kind of story she wanted to be in, but that was how it worked, in this particular corner of London, in this particular decade. The painters decided what the picture was about, and the models held still. A candle burns low somewhere in a hallway, and the streets outside are quieting down, and two young women who don't yet know each other are both learning the same first lesson of this strange new work. That being looked at that carefully, that closely, is not the same as being seen. The first thing you'd notice walking into a painter's studio in 1850 is the light. Not warm light, not welcoming light. The cold, flat, even light that comes from a window facing north. That was what painters wanted. North light doesn't shift through the day the way south-facing sunlight does, doesn't cast moving shadows across a canvas, doesn't change the colour of skin from morning to afternoon. It's steady and grey, the kind of light that makes a room feel as if the weather has come indoors and sat down. And underneath that light, the smell. Linseed oil, thick and slightly sweet the way a crushed nut smells, and turpentine underneath it, sharper, catching at the back of your throat. The faint sourness of rabbit skin glue warming in a pot on a small spirit stove. Paint rags draped over the backs of chairs. Jars of pigment, some ground from minerals, some from plants, a few from compounds so poisonous that the painters who used them didn't always live to finish their careers. This was the air a model breathed for hours at a time, standing still while the light didn't change and the smell didn't change and the painter didn't speak. The studios themselves were not grand. The young Pre-Raphaelites couldn't afford grand. Gabriel Rossetti and Walter Deverell shared a set of rooms in Red Lion Square, a decent but unglamorous address in Holborn, the kind of place where you could afford the rent if you split it and didn't eat too well. The landlord, who'd clearly had trouble with painters before, made his position known from the start. Keep your models under some gentlemanly restraint, he told them, because he'd seen other artists sacrifice the dignity of art to what he called the baseness of passion. He didn't name anyone in particular, and he didn't need to. The warning hung in the air like turpentine fumes, and the young men who received it, earnest, idealistic, desperate to prove they weren't that kind of painter, took it seriously. Or at least, they took it seriously enough to keep the door open when a model was sitting. Holman Hunt, a few miles away in Chelsea, had a slightly grander arrangement at Prospect Place, but the same anxieties followed him through the door. He was painting subjects that required the physical presence of young women. Women kneeling, women reclining, women in states of emotional extremity that could only be captured if you had a real body in front of you, arranged just so, held in place for hours. This was the fundamental bargain of Victorian figure painting. You needed a model, and a model needed to be alone with you. And the fact of that aloneness, in a culture that treated unchaperoned contact between men and women as a moral event, meant that every sitting carried a faint charge of scandal, whether anything scandalous happened or not. And here's the thing about modelling that I think gets lost in the retelling. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't even interesting most of the time. You came to the studio, by omnibus if you could afford it, on foot if you couldn't. You were shown the costume if there was one, and you put it on, usually behind a screen or in a separate room, though in some studios the screen was a suggestion rather than a guarantee. Then you were positioned. The painter moved your arm, tilted your chin, told you where to look, and then you held it. You held it for an hour, sometimes 2, sometimes longer if the painter lost track of time, or was working on a passage that couldn't be interrupted. Your muscles locked and your back ached. A cramp would start in your calf or your shoulder, and you'd breathe through it because breaking the pose meant starting over, and starting over meant the painter would sigh, and the painter's sigh meant you might not be asked back. 1 shilling an hour, that was the going rate for a clothed model, and it was decent money. Better than millinery, better than dressmaking, better than a great many of the jobs available to a young woman without connections. But you earned it with your stillness, your patience, and your willingness to be treated for the duration of the sitting as an object. The costumes were their own ordeal. Victorian painters who worked on historical and literary subjects kept trunks full of old clothes, borrowed garments, theatrical pieces picked up at second-hand shops. Some of them were beautiful. Embroidered silks, brocades with real gold thread, velvet cloaks with fur collars that had once belonged to someone who could afford such things. But beautiful didn't mean comfortable, and historical didn't mean modest. When Lizzie sat for Deverell's 12th night, she wore a costume that showed her legs, a thing no respectable young woman did in 1850, not in public, not in private, not for anyone. The tunic ended above the knee, the stockings were bright and mismatched, the slippers pointed and absurd. She was playing viola disguised as Cesario, a woman dressed as a boy, and the costume was meant to be charming and theatrical. But for the woman wearing it, a milliner's assistant from the Old Kent Road sitting in a room full of young men who weren't her relatives, it would have been something closer to exposure. She couldn't have been used to it, and she might never have got used to it. And yet she sat, and she held still, and she came back. Not all models wore costumes, of course. There were those who sat only for heads and hands, a less compromising arrangement, since it required nothing more than your own face, and your ability to hold an expression. And then there were the nude models, and the distance between those two categories was the distance between respectability and ruin. The history of artist models in England was tangled up, almost from the beginning, with the history of prostitution. When the Royal Academy first opened its doors, nude models had been recruited from brothels, and the association stuck. A woman who took off her clothes in a studio might be a professional model, and nothing else. But the world outside that studio would never entirely believe it. The Pre-Raphaelites, who were young and anxious about their reputations and genuinely believed in a purer kind of art, dealt with this problem by mostly avoiding the nude altogether. They painted clothed figures, costumed figures, elaborately draped figures. And when they absolutely had to study from a naked body, they did it at subscription life classes like the weekly drawing sessions at Clipstone Street, where the arrangement was formal and the setting was professional. There's something I keep coming back to about Clipstone Street. It was a small, unremarkable room where painters gathered to draw from models on a regular schedule. 2 women named Mrs. May and Miss Gyson appeared there regularly throughout 1851, names that appear in the record and then vanish, leaving nothing behind except the fact that they showed up week after week, held their bodies in whatever position was asked of them, and went home. We don't know what Mrs. May looked like, or whether Miss Gyson enjoyed the work or endured it. We know they were there, and early in 1852, a new girl arrived, Anne Ryan, who was described by the men who drew her as a little beauty, dark-haired, with lips like cherries. John Millais hired her for several of his most famous early paintings, and his portrait shows a girl with a lively, confident face. But her story, as Millais' son told it years later, was cautionary. Her beauty was a fatal gift, he wrote. She wound up married to a stableman, and what came afterward was unhappy. He didn't say what happened to her, said only that his father was always reluctant to talk about it, feeling perhaps that the attention he'd given her looks might in some small way have helped to turn her head. The phrase is telling. It assumes that beauty, when publicly noticed, becomes a kind of curse, and that the person who noticed it bears only a gentle, regretful kind of responsibility. the kind that comes with a sigh and a sad shake of the head rather than any actual reckoning. But most models at Clipstone Street weren't tragedies. They were working women doing a job. They came, they posed, they collected their pay, and they left. The tragedy, when it happened, was written by the men who told their stories afterward, men who needed the narrative to end badly because a woman who modelled and then lived an ordinary life wasn't interesting enough to write about. The ones who fell, the ones who married badly, the ones whose beauty proved fatal, those were the stories worth telling. The quiet ones, the ones who posed and then went home and had dinner and mended their stockings and got on with things. They disappeared from the record entirely, and that silence is its own kind of erasure, almost more thorough than the dramatic versions because at least the dramatic versions remembered them. Consider what it meant to be Lizzie, moving between these studios in the early months of 1850. She'd finished with Deverell's Twelfth Night and moved on to Holman Hunt, who was working on a large canvas of an ancient British family sheltering a Christian missionary from persecution. For this, her pose had her gripping a shallow basin and a cloth, dabbing at the missionary's wounds. Her costume was rough, a shapeless skirt made of something that looked like sacking topped with a cape of coarse fabric. One arm was bare to the shoulder. Her face in the finished painting is plain and anxious, nothing like the ethereal beauty the legend would later require. Hunt was going for historical accuracy, and historical accuracy in this case meant making a tradesman's daughter from South London look like a woman from the Dark Ages. The hair was pulled flat, the expression was worried, and the overall impression was of someone who'd been sleeping outdoors and hadn't eaten well. Not a flattering portrait, and probably not a flattering experience, to see yourself rendered that way. But Lizzie came when she was called and held her poses and gave the painter what he needed. She was, by all accounts, a reliable worker, punctual, patient, professional, in a way that the well-bred young ladies of the painter's own circles often weren't. Hunt noted that she was easier to work with than the respectable girls he sometimes persuaded to sit, who tended to fidget and complain and bring their mothers, and then came the next job, and the next costume. For Hunt's Two Gentlemen of Verona, she was dressed as Sylvia, a duke's daughter, this time, in a finely embroidered satin gown, with her hair swept up under a gold fillet and a small ornamental headpiece. Kneeling for that painting was miserable. The original design had Sylvia leaning backward in a gesture of horror and relief, but that proved impossible to hold for any length of time, so the position was simplified. Even so, it was hard work. Knees on the floor, back straight, arms extended, face arranged to express the precise combination of fear and gratitude that a rescued noblewoman should display. When the painting was exhibited, the art critic John Ruskin singled out Sylvia's face for criticism, complaining about the commonness of her features. Hunt agreed, and he repainted the face. Years later, he blamed himself for not doing his model justice, but the truth was simpler and more brutal. Lizzie's real face had been too real for the painting. She didn't look enough like a duke's daughter, so her features were taken out and replaced with something more acceptable, something closer to what a critic's eye expected a beautiful woman to look like. Her body stayed in the painting, but her face was erased. You know what gets me about that? It wasn't that she was ugly. She wasn't. Not by any reasonable measure. It was that she was specific. She had a particular face with particular features. The long top lip, the pale lashes, the prominent eyelids, the slightly protruding teeth that later admirers would learn to call ethereal and haunting, but that, at this stage, was simply her face, the face of a working woman from the Old Kent Road. And in a painting that was supposed to represent ideal beauty, specificity was a problem. The whole point of figure painting, at least as the Academy understood it, was to transcend the individual and reach toward the universal. A model's job was to lend her body to that process, and then disappear. Lizzie lent her body, and then she was literally painted out of her own portrait. There's a particular kind of cruelty in that. Not intentional, not personal, but structural. The system needed her and then needed her not to be herself. She didn't complain, or if she did, nobody wrote it down. She moved on to the next sitting, and the world inside these studios, with its cold north light and its turpentine air and its strange borrowed costumes, became, day by day, the world she knew. Not the bonnet shop anymore, not the Old Kent Road. This world of quiet rooms and long silences and men who looked at her without seeing her, painting the shape of her body while erasing the fact of her face. The light outside is dimming now. Somewhere a painter is cleaning his brushes, drawing a rag across the bristles with the slow, careful motion of a man who treats his tools better than he treats his models. And somewhere a young woman is putting her own clothes back on, folding the borrowed gown, stepping out into the evening air that smells of coal smoke and horses and the last of the day. But there's one more thing about these rooms that's worth knowing, because it tells you something about the invisible rules that governed everything. When Lizzie sat for Holman Hunt's painting of The Light of the World, she wasn't the only woman in the studio that season. Gabriel's sister, Christina Rossetti, also modelled for the same picture, both of them sitting for the head of Christ, which Hunt intended as an idealised rendering drawn from multiple faces. The two women never posed at the same time and probably never met in that studio, but the difference in how they were treated tells you everything you need to know about what class meant in these rooms. Christina came with her mother. That was the rule for a lady. You didn't go alone to a man's studio, any more than you'd go alone to a man's rooms for any other reason. Mrs. Rossetti sat in a corner, or on a chair by the door, or wherever she could be present without being in the way, and her presence turned the sitting from something questionable into something safe. Christina wasn't paid. She was doing a favour for a family friend, and favours between social equals didn't involve money. She came when it was convenient for her. She sat for as long as she felt like sitting, and she left when she was done. Lizzie, by contrast, came alone, walking across London by herself, from the Old Kent Road to Chelsea, a journey of several miles through streets that were not always kind to unaccompanied women. She wasn't chaperoned because she couldn't afford a chaperone, and because, as a working girl, she wasn't expected to need one. Chaperones were for ladies, and ladies were defined in part by the fact that they didn't work for money. Lizzie worked for money, earning her shillings 1 hour at a time, and the very fact of that transaction, coins changing hands between a man and a young woman in a private room, placed her, in the eyes of Victorian propriety, somewhere below the line of complete respectability, no matter how properly she behaved, no matter how fully she was clothed. I think about those two women sitting for the same painting, in the same room, weeks apart, one with her mother and one without, one for free and one for a shilling an hour. The painting didn't know the difference. Christ's face in The Light of the World is an ideal, smooth, symmetrical, belonging to nobody in particular. But the two women who contributed to it occupied entirely different positions in the world, and the studio, for all its claims to be a space apart from ordinary life, reproduced those positions exactly. The rules of the street followed you through the door, and the rules of class followed you onto the model stand. And the only person in the room who didn't have to think about any of it was the painter. There's another detail from this period that catches at me. Among the painters and their friends, Lizzie had a nickname. They called her the Cid, a name that came from the standard practice of referring to models by their surnames only, the way you'd refer to a servant or a horse, or any other useful thing that didn't require the courtesy of a first name. The Cid. Not Lizzie, not Miss Siddle, the Cid. Gabriel used it in letters to his sister, slipping between affection and this casual, half-dismissive shorthand. He wrote about her drawing, praised her talent, described her homemade dresses, and then called her the Cid, as though she were a piece of studio furniture that happened to have opinions. The nickname was fond, but it was also, in a way he probably couldn't see, a tiny act of possession, a reminder that she existed in these rooms on their terms, not her own, that she was a model first, a person second, and whatever else she might be. A woman with ambitions, a woman falling in love, a woman who complained that nobody cared about her soul. That was decoration. Ornamental. Nice, but not the point. Because the point, in these studios, was always the painting. The painting was what mattered, and the model was a necessary inconvenience. Necessary because you couldn't paint the human figure without one. Inconvenient because the human figure came attached to a human being with cold feet and a sore back, and opinions about whether the costume made her look ridiculous. The best models were the ones who could most completely suppress the fact of their own existence. Hold still, don't speak, don't complain when the lamp goes out and the water turns cold. Don't let your face show what you're feeling, because what you're feeling isn't the painting's concern. Be the shape the painter needs, and nothing more. The light is fading in the studio. The painter puts down his brush, and somewhere in the quieting room, a young woman unclenches her fingers, and lets her shoulders drop and becomes for a moment herself again. You've probably seen the painting. Even if you don't know its name, even if you've never been to the Tate or opened a book about Victorian art, you've seen it somewhere. On a poster, on a mug, on the cover of a novel you read in school. A young woman floating in a stream, her dress spread around her like a stained glass window laid flat on the water. Her mouth is slightly open, her hands loosely raised, palms up, as though she's offering the surface something she can't quite hold. Flowers drift near her fingers. Buttercups, daisies, poppies, a chain of violets slipping from her hand. She looks peaceful, as though the water was made to receive her, and the sky was arranged just for this moment. There's no fear in the image and no struggle, just a woman and a stream, and the slow, quiet fact of drowning made to look like something beautiful. That painting is Ophelia by John Everett Millais. It was finished in the summer of 1852, and it's now one of the most famous images in all of English art. And behind it, behind the water and the flowers and the perfect stillness of that pale, upturned face, there is a real afternoon in a London studio, a tin bathtub, a borrowed dress, and a young woman who didn't say a word when the water turned cold. The background was painted first. Millais spent months on it, working outdoors by the bank of the Hogsmill River in Surrey, sitting in the long grass with his canvas propped in front of him, painting every leaf and petal and blade with the obsessive poor-level detail that was the Pre-Raphaelite signature. The water alone took weeks. He caught the way light moved through it, the way weeds curled beneath the surface, the way a willow branch trailed its fingers across the current. By the time he was ready to add the figure, the actual body of Ophelia, he'd been working for the better part of a year, and the background was so densely, minutely painted that the woman who floated in it would need to match its impossible precision. Every fold of her dress, every strand of her hair, every shadow on her throat would have to look as real as the buttercups behind her, which meant he couldn't fake it, couldn't paint from memory or imagination, couldn't do without a woman lying in actual water. The commission went to Lizzie, though it's not entirely clear how Millais chose her. One possibility is that he'd seen the drawings Gabriel Rossetti had been making of her that autumn. Studies for a painting of Delia, a poet's wife, in which Lizzie posed with her hair loose and her eyes closed, and a strand of it caught between her teeth. Gabriel's drawings had done something remarkable to her. Under Hunt's brush, Lizzie had looked plain. A working girl, unremarkable, with a long face and prominent eyelids and features that Ruskin would later describe, with characteristically brutal precision, as common. But under Gabriel's hand, something different happened. He didn't make her conventionally pretty, but he found in her face a quality of tenderness and inward feeling that other painters had missed entirely. Hunt would later observe, with the faint sourness of a rival, that Gabriel's instinct when sketching any face was to reshape it toward his own favourite type, and that the result could be lovely to look at, but anyone searching for an actual likeness would have to squint. Whether that's fair or not, the Delia studies are full of a warmth that none of Lizzie's earlier portraits contain. She looks alive in them, as though she's thinking about something that matters to her. And it's possible that Millais saw those drawings and recognised in them exactly the quality he needed for Ophelia. A woman who could look like she was feeling something genuine, even while lying perfectly still. But before she could lie still, something else happened. In January of 1852, Lizzie's elder brother Charles died. He was in his mid-20s, and the cause of death was listed as an illness of the glandular system. Lizzie had sat at his bedside for weeks, nursing him through it, watching someone she loved diminish. The Pre-Raphaelite circle barely noticed. William Michael Rossetti, whose job it was to notice things, later placed Charles's death at entirely the wrong date, claiming it happened before Lizzie had even met Gabriel. The family's grief was private, but the economic blow was not. Charles had been the eldest son, the one closest to earning a proper wage in his father's trade. Without him, the next boy in line was James, only 13, still years away from being useful. The pressure on Lizzie to keep earning tightened. Millais received a letter from her explaining that owing to her brother's death she couldn't sit for a fortnight. A fortnight. That was the length of mourning a working model could afford. Then she went back to work. Millais started with the head, drawing and painting Lizzie's face in the early weeks, completing that part by early March. Her expression in the finished work, the half-open mouth, the glassy distance in her eyes, the faint flush on her cheeks, would become one of the most scrutinised faces in art history, analysed by generations of students and critics for what it reveals about madness, about femininity, about the Victorian relationship with death and water and flowers. None of those analyses mention that the woman behind the face had just buried her brother. None of them wonder whether the look on her face owed something to grief. Then came the body, and this is the part of the story that everybody knows, the part that gets retold in every documentary and every art history lecture, and every coffee table book about the Pre-Raphaelites, though somehow it's always told as though it were charming rather than appalling. Millais needed Lizzie to lie in water, not a river. That would have been impractical and probably fatal, but a bathtub in his studio filled to the brim. The tub was tin, the kind of portable bath that a household would bring out on washing day, long enough to lie in if you bent your knees slightly. He found a dress for her, an old garment, dirty and crumpled, heavily worked with silver embroidery that had gone dark with tarnish. It was the kind of thing you might find in a theatrical costumier's back room or a rag merchant's stall, something that had once been expensive and was now simply strange. Lizzie put it on, lay down in the bathtub, and the water came up around her, and the heavy dress, waterlogged, spread out across the surface the way fabric does when it's saturated. Not floating exactly, but suspended, held by the tension between sinking and staying. Her hair fanned out around her head, her arms lifted slightly, palms up, in the pose Millais had designed. And underneath the tub, to keep the water from going cold, he placed a row of small oil lamps, their flames just strong enough to warm the tin from below. I keep trying to imagine what that felt like, not the painting, which is extraordinary, but the physical experience. Lying in a metal tub, in your clothes, in a room that smelled of turpentine and damp wool, with water pressing against your ribs and your ears half submerged so that every sound went muffled and strange. The dress would have been heavy, silver embroidery, even tarnished, adds weight, and wet fabric clings. Your body would have wanted to shift, to adjust, to find a position that didn't push the breath out of your lungs. But you couldn't shift because the painter was watching, the painter was working. The painter needed you exactly where you were, your chin at precisely that angle, your fingers curled just so, your lips parted to exactly the right degree of slackness. So you held still and breathed shallow and let the water do what it wanted to your body and kept your face arranged in the shape of a drowned woman who felt nothing at all. And then the lamps went out. It would have happened gradually. Oil lamps don't blow out the way candles do, they gutter, they dim, the flame shrinks to a blue thread and then vanishes. The warmth underneath the tub would have faded slowly. At first you might not have noticed, since the water was already cool, and a few degrees difference wouldn't have been dramatic. But as the minutes passed, and Millais, lost in his work, wasn't watching the lamps, wasn't thinking about the temperature of the water, wasn't thinking about anything except the angle of the light on wet fabric. The cold would have settled in. It would have started in your hands and feet, the way cold always does, and crept inward. Your fingers would have stiffened and your calves would have cramped. The dress, already heavy, would have felt heavier, pressing you down into water that was no longer lukewarm but properly, decisively cold. And Lizzie didn't say anything. That's the detail that lives at the centre of this story, the detail that makes it something more than an anecdote. She didn't call out to Millais, didn't sit up, didn't break the pose. She lay there, in the cold water, in the heavy dress, while the painter worked on and the afternoon wore away, and she kept her body arranged in the shape he needed until she couldn't feel her own hands. The account, as Millais' son told it years later, says she was quite benumbed by the time anyone noticed, that she contracted a severe cold and that she never complained. There it is, she never complained. It's written as though this were a virtue, and maybe it was by the standards of the room she was in. A good model didn't interrupt the painter. A good model endured discomfort in silence, because the painting mattered more than the model's body, and everyone in the room understood the hierarchy without needing to say it out loud. But you can read that silence another way too. You can read it as a young woman who'd spent her whole life being told, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that her comfort was not the point, that her job was to be useful, to hold still, to arrange herself according to someone else's requirements, and not to make trouble. She'd been doing it in the bonnet shop, in Deverell's studio, in Hunt's studio, in every room where she'd been positioned and told to stay. The cold water in the bathtub wasn't a new lesson. It was the same lesson, pushed to an extreme. Your body is a tool, use it quietly. Her father didn't see it that way. When Lizzie came home after the sitting, chilled through, coughing, probably running a fever, old Charles Siddle did what a tradesman's father would do. He wrote to Millais and threatened to take him to court for medical expenses and lost earnings. The amount he named was £50, which was a great deal of money for a family living above a cutlery shop on the Old Kent Road, and a relatively small amount for a painter whose career was already ascending. The matter was settled, as these things usually were, by compromise. Millais paid something, though less than 50, and Lizzie went back to work. The incident confirmed what the Pre-Raphaelite circle already knew, that Lizzie was a professional model, not Gabriel's beloved, not anybody's muse. She was a woman who could be injured on the job, whose father could threaten lawsuits, whose body had a market value you could calculate in shillings and pounds. And here's the thing about that painting. The one that came out of the bathtub, the one that now hangs in a temperature-controlled gallery behind glass, the one that schoolchildren are brought to see on field trips as an example of English artistic genius. It's beautiful. It really is. The colours are extraordinary. The greens alone contain more variation than most painters manage in an entire career. The flowers are botanically exact, and the water is so convincingly rendered that you can almost feel its weight. And Ophelia herself, floating in the centre of all that beauty, with her pale face and her parted lips and her hands open to the sky, is one of the most memorable images in the history of Western painting. But she's also a young woman who lay in cold water until she couldn't feel her body, and who didn't say a word about it, and who went home sick, and whose father had to threaten a lawsuit to get the painter to acknowledge that something had gone wrong. The painting doesn't show any of that, because paintings never do. They show the result and not the process, the drowned woman and not the working woman. They show the beautiful stillness, not the effort it took to produce it. And I think that's what stays with me most about Ophelia. Not the art. The art is beyond question, but the gap. The distance between what the painting asks you to feel and what the model actually felt. Millais wanted you to see transcendence, and Lizzie felt cold water. He wanted you to see the beauty of surrender, but she was holding a pose she wasn't allowed to break. He wanted you to feel the gentle tragedy of a woman slipping beneath the surface, and she was trying not to shiver. That gap is always there, in every painting made from a living model in a Victorian studio. But in Ophelia it's wider than usual, because the subject of the painting is a woman dying, and the reality behind the painting is a woman being slowly, carelessly hurt. The two things sit so close together they almost touch, and neither the painter nor the painting seems to notice. The water is still now, and the studio quiet. Somewhere in a narrow house on the Old Kent Road, a young woman is lying under blankets with a hot cloth pressed against her chest, and the silver dress is hanging on a hook in a painter's studio, drying in the cold air, and nobody in the room where it hangs is thinking about the body that was inside it. There's a footnote to this story that I want to sit with for a moment, because it tells you something about how quickly the machinery of art moved on, even when the people inside it were still hurting. Lizzie was back at work within weeks of the bathtub incident. The cold she'd caught didn't linger, or if it did, she couldn't afford to let it stop her. She went to Hunt's studio in Chelsea and sat to lend her hair to Hunt's painting of Christ carrying a lantern, a painting about spiritual revelation, about the Saviour standing at the door and knocking, about grace offered to those who would receive it. There's an irony in that which the painter certainly didn't intend. A woman who'd just been left to lie in freezing water because nobody thought to check the lamps was now lending her hair to a painting about divine compassion. Her body was still recovering from one painter's carelessness, and she was already being used by another. Meanwhile, the painting she'd nearly frozen for was making its way toward the Royal Academy exhibition of 1852, where it would be scrutinised by critics and crowds, and where its reputation would begin the long climb toward the permanent, unassailable fame it enjoys today. Millais was 23 years old, ambitious, gifted, relentlessly productive, and within a few years he would become one of the most celebrated painters in England, eventually accepting a baronetcy and the presidency of the Royal Academy itself. His career, in other words, was the opposite of Lizzie's. It went up, and everything about the bathtub, the cold water, the threat of a lawsuit, the fact that a model's father had to intervene because the model herself had been trained not to speak, all of that was folded into the painting's legend, retold as a colourful anecdote, a charming footnote to genius. The story was always about Millais, and Lizzie was the scenery, and the painting itself, hanging now in the Tate, visited by thousands of people every year who stand in front of it and feel something they can't quite name. The painting doesn't care about any of this. It does what great paintings do. It makes you forget that it was made. It presents itself as pure image, as though Ophelia had always existed, as though the stream and the flowers and the pale floating body were discovered rather than constructed. The labour has been erased, the cold water warmed retroactively by the beauty of the result, and the young woman who lay in the bathtub and held her breath and didn't complain has been absorbed so completely into the finished image that she's become invisible, which is, when you think about it, exactly what a Victorian model was supposed to be. The night settles and the lamps are out, and somewhere, in a painting that will outlast everyone who made it, a woman floats in water that will never get cold again. 1 shilling an hour. That was the number, and it's worth slowing down to understand what it meant, because the whole shape of a model's life turned on it. In 1850, a shilling was 12 pence and a pound was 20 shillings. A working woman in domestic service, a housemaid say, or a cook's assistant, might earn between £8 and £12 a year, with bed and board provided. A dressmaker working long hours during the season might bring home 8 or 9 shillings a week. A milliner's assistant, like Lizzie before she left the bonnet shop, earned a small wage that varied with the season and the shop's fortunes. But it was steady, predictable, and came with the understanding that you'd be there every day doing the same work for years. Modelling paid better, hour for hour. 1 shilling an hour meant that a full day's sitting, 6 or 7 hours, could earn you what a dressmaker made in a week. But it wasn't steady or predictable, and it came with conditions that no other form of women's work required. You worked when you were needed and sat idle when you weren't. A painter might need you every day for 3 weeks, then not at all for a month. You might have 2 commissions running at once, walking from one studio to another across London, changing costumes between sittings. Or you might have nothing, no word, no summons, no income, for weeks at a stretch, while the painters you'd worked for finished backgrounds and mixed colours and argued with their fathers about rent. In the entire 1851 census, across all of England, only 2 women listed their occupation as artist model. 2, out of the thousands of women who must have sat at one time or another in the cold light of a painter's studio. The rest either didn't think of it as a proper job, or didn't want anyone to know they did it, or both. Lizzie was one of the ones who didn't say. When the census man came to Kent Place in April of 1851, she was living at home with her parents and gave no occupation at all. She was 21, and she'd already sat for Deverell, Hunt and Gabriel Rossetti. Worn costumes, held poses, earned her shillings, but on the official record she was simply a daughter of the house, unoccupied, as though the work she did in those studios existed in some other world that the census couldn't see. And in a sense it did. Modelling wasn't a trade with a guild or an apprenticeship or a recognised path from learner to master. It was something you fell into, something that happened to you because a painter noticed your face, and it could end just as abruptly, when your looks changed, when you got older, when the painter moved on to someone else. The bonnet shop, for all its long hours and seasonal layoffs, had been a real trade. It had structure and a future, and modelling had neither. It had only the present moment, the current sitting, the shilling placed in your hand at the end of the afternoon. And yet Lizzie preferred it, which tells you something. Not about her vanity or her ambition, though she may have had both, but about the calculations a young working woman made in mid-Victorian London. The bonnet shop was respectable but exhausting. The pay was low and the work was seasonal. During the slack months between Christmas and Easter, milliners were laid off and had to find other ways to survive. Modelling filled those gaps and paid more per hour. It was less physically gruelling than standing behind a counter for 12 hours at a stretch, and it introduced you to a world, the world of studios and painters and literary conversations, that was more interesting than the world of ribbon dye and bonnet frames, even if that world didn't always treat you kindly. But modelling cost you something that millinery didn't, and the cost was invisible, which made it harder to calculate and impossible to get back. The line drawn in Victorian England between women who earned wages and women who lived on family income was one of the sharpest lines in the whole elaborate architecture of class. A lady did not work. A lady was supported by her father, by her husband, by her family's investments, by the quiet machinery of inherited income that made it possible for her to spend her days reading and visiting and embroidering without ever having to exchange labour for cash. The moment you took money for your time, you stepped across that line, you became a working woman, and a working woman was, by definition, not a lady. No matter how clean your hands were, no matter how carefully you spoke, no matter how neatly you dressed. For most working women, this didn't matter. If you were a servant or a factory hand or a shop girl, the question of whether you were a lady had been settled before you were born. But for someone like Lizzie, a cutler's daughter from the Old Kent Road, a family with quiet pretensions to lost gentility, a sister who was intensely proud of the Siddall name, the line was close enough to feel. The Siddalls weren't gentry, weren't even solidly middle class, but they were respectable, which in the Victorian lexicon meant something very specific. It meant that your women didn't have to work, or if they did it in a trade that could pass for genteel. Millinery was acceptable, clean, skilled, involving fashion and taste. It was the kind of work a clergyman's daughter might take up without shame. But modelling, standing alone in a room with a man who wasn't your relative, letting him study your body for hours, being paid by the hour for the use of your physical presence, that was something else. It didn't matter that Lizzie never took her clothes off, or that the painters she sat for were earnest young idealists who wanted to reform English art, not seduce their models. The structure of the transaction was enough. A young woman alone with a man being paid for her body's availability. The world drew its own conclusions. I keep thinking about the weight of that. Not the shilling itself. The shilling was welcome, necessary, a practical improvement over trimming bonnets. But the shadow behind the shilling, the knowledge that every time you walked to a painter's studio, every time you posed in a borrowed dress, every time you collected your money and walked home through the streets of South London, you were being seen in a certain way by anyone who knew what you did. You were being categorised, filed away in a drawer marked not quite respectable, alongside the barmaids and the actresses and the shop girls who flirted with young men on their way to work. And once you were in that drawer, getting out again was nearly impossible. This is the context in which the Ruskin episode makes sense. In 1855, when Lizzie had been modelling and drawing for several years, Gabriel engineered a meeting between her and John Ruskin, the most powerful art critic in England. Ruskin was wealthy, well-connected, and capable of making or destroying a painter's career with a single review. Gabriel's plan was simple and shrewd. If Ruskin could be persuaded to take an interest in Lizzie's own drawings, he might support her financially, freeing her from the dependence on modelling that kept her tethered to other men's studios and other men's vision. The meeting was carefully staged. Lizzie was taken to tea at the Ruskin family home at Denmark Hill, and she was presented, this is the crucial detail, not as a young professional artist, but as a lady. The entire afternoon was a performance, her manners on display, her reserve, her quiet speech, and it worked. Old Mr. Ruskin, the critic's father, pronounced that she could easily have passed for a woman of aristocratic birth. Ruskin himself described her as a remarkable and glorious being. His mother took Lizzie upstairs to examine her health and prescribed bone dust jelly as a restorative, with the proprietary confidence of a woman who has decided that this particular young person is worthy of her attention. The outcome was an offer of £150 a year, a stipend paid quarterly, in exchange for whatever drawings or paintings Lizzie might produce. It was a remarkable amount, more than 10 times what a housemaid earned annually, enough to support a single woman in comfort, to rent her own rooms, to buy materials, to live independently of both her family and the painters who had been employing her. It was, in every practical sense, a liberation. And Lizzie, to her credit, was suspicious of it. She preferred, she said, to have her drawings judged and purchased on their own quality, rather than take a regular allowance that would make her feel dependent. Gabriel disagreed. He thought the stipend was better, more reliable, more secure, a guaranteed income regardless of whether she produced anything worth buying, and he was frank about his intentions. She would be, he told a friend, sternly coerced if necessary. She was coerced, and she took the stipend. And almost immediately Ruskin began issuing instructions, not about her art but about her life. She should leave London, go to the country, consult a physician. She should under no circumstances think of going to Italy, which he feared would overstimulate her so severely she'd collapse within days. If she were his own sister, he wrote, he'd argue for something quiet and remote. A small house tucked into a valley in Wales. The language is protective, paternal, suffocating, and it is also the language of ownership. Ruskin was paying for Lizzie's time the same way the painters had been paying for her time, 1 shilling an hour or £150 a year. The currency changed, but the structure didn't. She was being kept, though the word was never used, because the word had other meanings that nobody wanted to invoke. But the shape of the arrangement, a wealthy man paying a younger woman a regular income in exchange for her compliance and her availability, was legible to everyone in the room, even if nobody said it out loud. There's a pattern here, and I don't think it's accidental. Every financial relationship Lizzie entered, from the bonnet shop to the studio to the Ruskin stipend, reproduced the same basic structure. Someone else decided what her time was worth. Someone else set the terms. Someone else held the power to continue or withdraw the arrangement, and she held the power to say yes or no. And that was all. A shilling an hour, or £150 a year. A commission that might come tomorrow or might never come again. Her entire economic life was built on other people's decisions about her value, and those decisions were always made by men. And the peculiar cruelty of the system was that it disguised itself as generosity. Deverell's mother hadn't forced Lizzie to leave the bonnet shop, she'd offered her an opportunity. Hunt hadn't compelled Annie to model, he'd rescued her from the streets. Ruskin hadn't bought Lizzie's obedience, he'd bestowed a gift. Every transaction came wrapped in the language of kindness, and the kindness was real as far as it went, but it never went far enough to let the woman on the other end of the transaction set her own price. The night is quiet now and the studio's empty, and somewhere in a narrow house on the old Kent road, a young woman is counting coins on a kitchen table. 12 pennies to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound, while outside the window the city goes on being the city, indifferent to the small, precise arithmetic of a life lived 1 hour at a time. But there's another side to this economy that's worth sitting with, because it tells you something about the strange, upside-down world of the Pre-Raphaelite studios. The painters who were paying Lizzie a shilling an hour could barely afford to pay themselves. Gabriel Rossetti was 24 years old and couldn't afford to move out of his parents' house. He shared studios with friends because he couldn't rent one alone. When he finally found rooms of his own, Chatham Place, a set of apartments near Blackfriars Bridge, he needed his brother William Michael, who had a steady job as a civil service clerk, to co-sign for the rent. Ford Maddox Brown, the older painter who was a friend and mentor to the group, lived on a tiny income from a scrap of inherited property and whatever he could scrape together from occasional sales. Hunt had slightly more, but his career was still precarious, and a single painting that failed to sell could leave him unable to buy materials for the next one. These were not wealthy men, not patrons or aristocrats. They were young artists from families that had come down in the world, or never been very far up in it, and they paid their models the going rate because that was what the transaction required, not because they had money to spare. And yet the shilling changed hands every time in one direction only. The painter held the coin, and the model received it. The painter decided when the sitting began and when it ended, which costume would be worn and which pose would be held, whether the work was satisfactory or whether it needed to be done again. The model could say no, could refuse a sitting, could decline a costume, could walk away entirely. But saying no meant losing the shilling. And for a woman whose alternatives were the bonnet shop or domestic service or the garment trades, the shilling was not something you gave up lightly. So you wore the costume, held the pose, lay in the cold water, and you didn't complain. Not because you were passive. Lizzie was many things, but passive wasn't one of them. But because the arithmetic was clear. A shilling an hour for work that didn't break your body the way scrubbing floors did, in rooms that were more interesting than the back of a bonnet shop, with people who at least pretended to see you as something more than a pair of hands. It was a bargain, and it was also a trap. And the difference between a bargain and a trap is sometimes nothing more than how long you're stuck inside it. Consider Emma Hill, Ford Maddox Brown's model, and eventually his wife. Emma came from the country, the daughter of a bricklayer, or possibly a small farmer, depending on which version of her story you believe. She was soft-faced, pink-cheeked, with a mass of yellow hair the colour of harvest corn, and she had few accomplishments and very little of what the Victorians called savoir-faire. Brown painted her again and again throughout 1848 and 49, as Cordelia, as Juliet, as half a dozen other painted women whose beauty and composure bore no resemblance to Emma's own cheerful, uneducated warmth. At some point during those sittings, the relationship became sexual. By the spring of 1850, Emma was expecting a child. Brown recognised his responsibility but did not propose marriage. Emma wasn't considered suitable, socially, for marriage to a painter of professional standing, and she wasn't equipped to be stepmother to his daughter Lucy from his first marriage. Her standing as a model, and as what Victorian society bluntly termed a fallen woman, made things worse. So the child was born out of wedlock, and the facts were concealed, and the couple eventually married in the spring of 1853 in a ceremony kept secret from almost everyone they knew. Emma's story tells you what the shilling could cost, even when it wasn't being counted. She walked into a studio as a working model, and walked out, eventually, as a wife. But the path between those 2 points ran through secrecy, shame, illegitimacy, and the kind of careful social management that ate up everyone's energy and goodwill. Brown's friends knew about Emma, and they also knew not to mention her in polite company. When she finally appeared at social gatherings as Mrs. Brown, the performance of respectability required everyone to pretend that the earlier chapters of the story hadn't happened. And Emma herself, who was warm and generous and apparently very easy to like, spent the rest of her life living inside a carefully constructed fiction about her origins. A farmer's daughter from Herefordshire, a woman of simple rural virtue, not a model from a London studio who'd been seduced by her employer. The shilling, in Emma's case, had been converted into a wedding ring, but the conversion cost her the truth of her own life. This was the economy that Lizzie moved through. Not just the economy of coins and hours and sittings, but the economy of reputation, the invisible ledger that tracked what a woman was worth in a society that measured female value in terms of purity, modesty, and distance from the marketplace. Every shilling Lizzie earned moved her one entry further into the wrong column of that ledger. Every afternoon spent alone in a painter's studio was a debit against her respectability. And the maddening thing, the thing that makes you want to reach back through time and shake somebody, is that the painters who paid her those shillings were the same men who would later insist, with absolute sincerity, that she had always been a lady. William Michael Rossetti called her refined, Hunt praised her gentlemanly restraint, and old Mr. Ruskin called her a natural aristocrat. They needed her to be a lady because the alternative, that they had been spending their afternoons alone with a working girl, reflected badly on them. So they rewrote her, the way they rewrote everything. They took the shilling out of her hand and replaced it with a halo, and they expected her to be grateful for the exchange. The coins are quiet on the table and the house is dark, and a young woman who knows exactly what she's worth, because she's been told the number often enough, 1 shilling, 1 hour, 12 pennies, 1 pose, is lying awake, doing the mathematics of a life that never quite adds up. When Holman Hunt left England for the Holy Land in January of 1854, he left behind a painting, a plan, and a girl. The painting was The Awakening Conscience, freshly finished and destined for the Royal Academy. The plan was to return in a year or two to a young woman who had been scrubbed clean of her origins and remade into someone he could marry. And the girl was Annie Miller, who was 15 or 16 years old, who couldn't read or write properly, who had lice in her hair and the wrong accent and the wrong manners, and every other wrong thing that a Victorian gentleman might catalogue when looking at a beautiful girl from a slum and thinking, with the particular confidence of a man who has never doubted his own goodness, that she could be saved. His plan had several moving parts, and Hunt arranged them with the same meticulous attention he brought to his paintings, starting with the education. Sarah Bradshaw, a former governess who lived with Hunt's landlady at Prospect Place in Chelsea, was engaged to teach Annie her letters, reading, writing, the basic grammar of a respectable woman's correspondence. Then, for the finer work, there was Mrs. Brummer, a genuine lady of good social standing who lived nearby in Cheyne Walk. Her job was harder and more intimate. Her task was to reshape the way Annie spoke, to sand down the Cockney, to teach her how to stand and sit correctly, how to walk into a room without looking as though she'd climbed through the window, how to dress her hair, how to hold a cup and saucer, how to conduct herself in both public and private company. In short, how to pass, how to erase, systematically and thoroughly, every trace of Crosskeys Court from her body, her voice and her bearing, and replace it with something that could be presented to the world as genteel. Hunt covered all costs, lessons, materials, whatever incidental expenses came up. But Annie herself received no allowance, and went on living with the cobbler uncle and the washerwoman aunt behind the pub, with nothing in her pocket. If she wanted pocket money, and she was a teenage girl in London, of course she did. She had to earn it the only way she knew how, by modelling. Hunt understood this, and he wasn't cruel exactly. He was systematic. So before he left for Palestine, he drew up a list of approved painters, the men Annie was permitted to sit for while he was away, Pre-Raphaelites and trusted friends, artists Hunt believed he could rely on not to take advantage of a pretty girl from Chelsea who was, in his view, dangerously unprotected. If anyone outside the list approached her, she was to refuse, and if she had questions about whether a particular commission was acceptable, she was to consult Fred Stevens, Hunt's closest friend and the man he'd appointed as her guardian, supervisor and informant in his absence. I want to say that slowly, because the weight of it deserves space. Hunt drew up a list of which men were allowed to look at Annie. He controlled who could hire her, who could be in a room with her, who could study her face, and he did this while he was thousands of miles away, in Egypt and Palestine, painting landscapes and scapegoats, and he expected his friends to enforce the list on his behalf. And they did, writing to him regularly with reports on Annie's behaviour. Millais wrote to say that Annie had been sitting for him, and that she was a good little girl whose conduct was entirely proper. Halliday, who'd trained under Hunt, added that between them, he and Millais had been keeping her busy with commissions. Fred Stevens sent longer, more detailed accounts. Annie had been out boating with him and Halliday. She was about to go and work for Augustus Egg. He checked on the propriety of the arrangement, and he believed she was a good girl. On one occasion, Fred reported that Annie had admitted to sitting for someone not on the approved list, and that he'd given her a talking to about it, and then gone to find the painter in question, and informed him, as he put it, of the position in which Hunt regarded himself concerning her danger. There's a sentence I can't let go of. The position in which Hunt regarded himself concerning her danger. Say it slowly. A man halfway around the globe has arranged for his friends to monitor a teenage girl's employment, her movements, her social contacts, her moral welfare. He has left instructions about which men may and may not look at her, and appointed a proxy to manage her schedule and her virtue. And the language used to describe all of this, the position, the danger, the careful inquiries about propriety, is the language of protection, of concern, of a decent man doing his best for a girl who can't protect herself. But it's also, almost word for word, the language of keeping a mistress, of maintaining at a distance total authority over a young woman's body and reputation, without having married her, without having made any formal commitment, and without having consulted her about any of it. Jan Marsh, who saw this more clearly than most, pointed out that the structure of Hunt's plan to reshape Annie was, in its essentials, no different from that of a man who purchased a woman outright and expected her to do as he wished. Hunt wasn't a villain, wasn't even, by the standards of his time, unusual. This was how relations between the sexes worked, whether inside marriage or outside it, and all the romantic language in the world couldn't change the underlying structure. He paid, she complied, and the only difference between Hunt's arrangement and the relationship he'd painted in The Awakening Conscience was that Hunt hadn't touched her, and he believed with absolute sincerity that this difference was the entire point. And meanwhile, Annie was learning. She was learning to shape her vowels differently, to flatten the cockney out of her speech and replace it with something smoother, something that wouldn't make a drawing room flinch. She was learning which fork to use and where to put her hands when she sat down, and how to enter a doorway without looking over her shoulder. She was learning, in other words, to perform a class she hadn't been born into, to wear respectability like one of the costumes she put on in a painter's studio, something that looked convincing from the outside but never quite fit against the skin. Mrs. Bramar and Sarah Bradshaw taught her, each in their own domain. Fred Stevens supervised, and Hunt paid the bills from Jerusalem, and the whole apparatus of improvement ground on week after week, turning a girl from Crosskeys Court into something that might, if you squinted, if you didn't ask too many questions, pass for a lady. There's something about this that reminds me of the paintings themselves. The Pre-Raphaelites were obsessed with surfaces. They painted every petal, every thread, every eyelash with an intensity that bordered on mania, because they believed that truth lived in the details, that if you got the surface right, the meaning would follow. Hunt's plan for Annie operated on the same principle. If you got the accent right, the posture right, the hairdressing right, the woman underneath would be transformed. The surface would become the self, the performance would become the person. It's a painter's logic, and it's wrong in the way that painters are sometimes wrong, brilliantly attentive to what things look like, and almost entirely blind to what they are. Annie, for her part, played along, went to her lessons and reformed her hair, as Fred noted approvingly in one of his letters. She declined commissions from painters not on the approved list, even when the refusal cost her money she needed. When the daughters of a baronet named Sir Julian Slade wanted her to sit for them, young women, not men, posing no conceivable moral danger, Annie hesitated, called twice at Stevens's lodgings for advice, and when she couldn't find him, declined entirely, on her own judgment, exhibiting a caution that went well beyond anything Hunt had actually required. She was being, by every available measure, a good girl. And the phrase turns up again and again in the letters, a good little girl, a good little goose, a good girl who behaves herself properly. The diminutives are gentle and devastating, reducing a young woman's entire existence to the question of whether she's doing what she's told. But Annie was also, in ways the letters only half reveal, a person with her own intelligence and instincts, streetwise, having grown up in a neighbourhood where survival depended on reading situations quickly and acting accordingly, and nothing in Mrs. Brammer's lessons about teacups and posture could erase that sharpness. When her father, who by this time was housed at the Royal Hospital on a military pension, refused to repay a sum of £2 he'd borrowed from her, she wrote urgently to Stevens about it. Stevens, running true to form, counselled submission. A daughter's correct behaviour, he told her, was self-sacrifice, especially the kind of self-sacrifice that the middle class expected and that Annie was being trained to perform. She dropped the matter, but the incident tells you something. Annie had money, not much, all of it earned by modelling, and her own father took it from her, and the man assigned to protect her interest told her to let it go, and she did, because that was what a lady would do. The system that was teaching her to be respectable was also teaching her to be robbed politely. You know what keeps catching at me about this whole arrangement? It's the way Hunt's sincerity made everything worse. If he'd been cynical, if he'd simply wanted an attractive girl from the slums to amuse himself with and had dressed the arrangement in respectable language to avoid scandal, the situation would have been ugly but legible. Everyone would have known what was happening, but Hunt wasn't cynical. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, that education and manners and the right kind of hairdressing could lift a girl out of poverty and transform her into a suitable wife. He held, as a friend once described it, a kind of internal court session before making any decision, and he always acted in accordance with its verdict. The problem was that the council never included Annie. Her opinions, her desires, her understanding of her own situation, none of these appear in the letters, the plans, the careful arrangements. She was the object of the improvement rather than its author, being sculpted the way Hunt shaped a figure on canvas, painstakingly, lovingly, with extraordinary attention to every surface detail, and with no interest whatsoever in what the figure might want to say for herself. The lamps are burning low in a small room in Chelsea. A young woman is practising the way she holds her shoulders, trying to remember which angle Mrs. Brammer said was correct. Outside, the streets she grew up on are still the same streets, the cobblestones, the courtyard, the smell of the public house and the river beyond it. She can hear them through the window, hear everything she's supposed to be leaving behind. And somewhere, in a distant country, a man with a paintbrush is composing a letter to his friend, asking whether the girl is behaving herself, whether the lessons are taking hold, whether the surface is beginning to look right. There's one more piece of this story that belongs here, because it shows you what the improvement project looked like from the other side of the letters, from the side that wasn't writing them. Fred Stevens, the appointed guardian, was a young man himself, a painter who'd belonged to the founding circle of Pre-Raphaelite brothers, but had already given up art in favour of writing about it. He was earnest, loyal to Hunt, and profoundly uncomfortable with the role he'd been given. His letters to Hunt walk a careful line between reassurance and anxiety, as though he knows that any hint of trouble will provoke a crisis from the Holy Land that he'll have to manage from Chelsea. When he writes about Annie, he uses the same careful, diminishing language everyone used. She's a good girl, she's behaving, she's reformed her hair. But you can read between the lines. He's not monitoring a charge so much as babysitting a situation that could explode at any moment, and he knows it. On one of those evenings, Fred was writing a letter to Hunt with Annie sitting across the room from him, turning the pages of a novel, Thackeray's Pendennis, a story about a young man's education and moral development, which may or may not have been an intentional choice. Fred tried to get her to add a few words to the letter in her own hand. She refused, claiming she couldn't write, though Fred knew she could perfectly well, because she'd been sending him letters for months. The refusal wasn't inability, but something else. A reluctance, perhaps, to perform her improvement for an audience she couldn't see. To put her new, careful handwriting on display for a man in Palestine who'd never asked her what she wanted to learn, only what she needed to become. Or maybe she simply didn't want to write to Holman Hunt. Maybe the whole arrangement, the lessons, the supervision, the approved list, the regular dispatches about her conduct, felt less like education and more like a cage with pleasant wallpaper, and putting pen to paper for the man who'd built it was one compliance too many. So Fred wrote the polite phrases for her. She trusts you are in good health and asks to be warmly remembered. Those words, the trusts, the asks, the warmly, came straight from Mrs. Bramar's lessons, the grammar of middle-class deference that Annie was being taught to reproduce. They don't sound like a girl from Crosskeys Court. They sound like someone performing a script, hitting the marks, saying what the scene requires. And underneath the performance, underneath the reformed hair and the careful vowels and the novel held open on her lap, there was still Annie, the girl who'd grown up behind a pub, who could read a room faster than any of them, who'd already figured out that the quickest way through this arrangement was to give everyone exactly what they wanted to hear. Years later, after Hunt came home, after the engagement that followed the improvement fell apart, after Annie married someone else entirely and lived a life that bore no resemblance to anything they'd planned for her. Years later, the Pre-Raphaelite circle would tell the story of Annie Miller as a cautionary tale. The ungrateful girl, the one who couldn't be saved. The street girl who was given every advantage and threw it all away. But they never told the other version. The version where a teenage girl from a slum was taken up by a man who wanted to reshape her in his own image, who paid for her education but not her freedom, who controlled her movements from across the world, who expected her to become a different person and then to love him for making her do it. That version wasn't interesting to them. It didn't have the right shape, didn't end with a moral. But it's the version that's true, and it sits here, in the quiet of a Chelsea evening, in the scratching of Fred's pen and the turning of Annie's pages, in the approved list tucked into a drawer somewhere, and the letters crossing the Mediterranean with their reports of a young woman's obedience. She trusts you are in good health, and asks to be warmly remembered. The candle flickers and the pen scratches, and outside the tide is turning on the river, pulling the water toward the sea, the way it always does, whether anyone is watching or not. And there's one last irony I want to hold up to the lamplight before we move on. The painting that started all of this, The Awakening Conscience, the one Annie sat for in the autumn of 1853, was a picture about a kept woman, a woman maintained by a man, furnished with bright new things, installed in rooms that weren't her own. Hunt painted it as a moral warning. The woman in the painting is struck by a sudden flash of understanding. She sees what she's become, sees the transaction she's trapped in, and in that moment of clarity she begins to rise from her lover's lap, her face turned toward the light from the window. The painting was meant to be about redemption, about the possibility of escape. But the woman Hunt used to embody that escape was herself being kept. Annie's lessons, Annie's movements, Annie's list of permitted employers, all of it was paid for by Hunt, managed by Hunt's friend, subject to Hunt's approval. The surface of the painting said one thing, and the life behind it said another. And Hunt, who was capable of extraordinary visual precision, who could paint the grain of a wooden floor so accurately you could count the rings in the timber, couldn't see the resemblance between the arrangement he'd painted and the arrangement he'd built. The woman on the canvas was waking up, and the woman in the studio was still being told where to sit. The rules were everywhere. They weren't written down. Nobody published a handbook called How to Behave When a Painter Asks You to Sit. But everyone knew them, the way everyone knows the rules of a game that's been played so long nobody remembers who invented it. The rules governed who could approach whom and how and where. They governed what could be said and what had to remain unspoken. They governed the difference between a compliment and a proposition, between a favour and a transaction, between a lady and a model. And they were enforced not by any authority, but by the slow, relentless pressure of opinion, the raised eyebrow, the whispered aside, the letter that doesn't arrive, the invitation that's quietly withdrawn. Start with the simplest rule, the one that sat underneath all the others like a foundation stone, A respectable woman did not go alone to a man's rooms. That was it. The bedrock. Everything else. The chaperones. The negotiations through mothers. The careful calibration of who could be trusted and who could not. Was built on top of that single, non-negotiable fact. A woman alone with a man was a woman whose reputation was at risk, and a reputation, once damaged, could not be repaired. It didn't matter what actually happened in the room. What mattered was what could be imagined, what could be inferred, what could be whispered about afterward in drawing rooms and parlours and the back passages of other people's houses. The reality was irrelevant, and the appearance was everything. For a painter who needed a female model, this created a problem that was practical before it was moral. You needed a woman in your studio. You needed her alone, because you couldn't paint with half a dozen chaperones watching over your shoulder. You needed her for hours at a time, in costumes that were sometimes intimate, in poses that were sometimes suggestive, in a relationship that was, by its nature, one of sustained physical attention, you looking at her body carefully for as long as it took. And every element of that arrangement, read through the lens of Victorian propriety, looked exactly like the prelude to something the rules were designed to prevent. So you managed the appearance. You brought your mother to the bonnet shop the way Gabriel did. You wrote to the model's parents asking formal permission the way Hunt did. You kept the studio door open during sittings. You worked in shared spaces where another painter's presence served as an informal guarantee that nothing improper was taking place. You referred to the model by her surname, the Sid, Miss Ryan, Miss Siddle, maintaining a verbal distance that matched the physical distance the rules required. And if anyone asked, you made it clear that the relationship was professional, that the model was a useful piece of equipment, that whatever happened in your studio was in the service of art and nothing else. But the rules applied unevenly, and the unevenness was the whole point. When Mrs. Deverell went to Cranbourne Alley to ask whether Lizzie could sit for her son, she was performing a ritual that had nothing to do with Lizzie's wishes, and everything to do with demonstrating that the Deverells were the kind of family who observed the proprieties. The ritual required a lady to vouch for the painter. It required the model's employer, not the model herself, to grant permission. And it required Lizzie's mother, all the way out on the Old Kent Road, to be consulted before her 20-year-old daughter could take a job that paid better than the one she already had. The message was clear. A working woman's body did not belong to her. It belonged to a chain of authority, employer, mother, painter's mother, and her role was to pass through that chain without incident, like a parcel being handed from one pair of approved hands to another. Some women pushed back. A young servant whom Stevens had located for Gabriel in the spring of 1850 simply refused. Gabriel needed a red-haired model for his painting of the Virgin Mary, and Stevens located a suitable girl, the right colouring, the right build, presumably willing to earn a few shillings. But she took one look at the arrangement and said no. We don't know her name or her reasons. The record says only that she point-blank refused the whole business, and Gabriel was left scrambling for a replacement. It's a tiny moment, barely a footnote in the Pre-Raphaelite story, but it tells you something. The rules could be used as a shield. A woman who didn't want to model could invoke the very proprieties that governed her life and turn them into a refusal that nobody could argue with. I won't sit alone with a man in his studio. Nobody could call her unreasonable for saying that. The rules were on her side. For once, and perhaps for the only time, the system that constrained women also protected them. Other women negotiated. When Jane Burden was spotted by Gabriel at a theatre in Oxford in 1857, she was 18 years old, the daughter of a groom and a laundress, sitting in the cheap gallery seats with her younger sister Bessie. Gabriel approached her after the performance and asked if she'd come the next day to model for the murals he and his friends were painting at the Oxford Union. She probably didn't know what he meant, one of the painters later remarked, and perhaps her bewilderment was genuine. Or perhaps she understood perfectly well that a strange man asking a young woman to come to his rooms was precisely the kind of encounter the rules existed to prevent. She agreed, but she didn't show up. Maybe her mother warned her. Maybe she thought better of it on her own. A few days later, another of the painters, Ned Jones, happened to see her in town and renewed the invitation, and this time, after talking things over with her parents, she agreed to come. The negotiation is the interesting part. It wasn't Lizzie's mother being visited on the Old Kent Road, and it wasn't a formal letter to her father asking permission. It was something messier, more improvisational. A working-class family trying to figure out whether this particular opportunity was safe, whether these particular young men could be trusted, whether the risk to their daughter's reputation was worth whatever she might gain. They decided yes, but the fact that they had to decide at all, that every model's entry into the studio world required this kind of calculation, this weighing of risk against reward, this consultation with parents and siblings and neighbours, tells you how heavy the rules sat on every woman who considered stepping through that door. And then there was the other side of the rules, and the side that protected not the women but the men. The Pre-Raphaelites were young and ambitious, and acutely aware that their reputations were fragile. A whisper of impropriety could damage a painter's career as surely as a bad review, and the whispers were always there, hanging in the studio air like the smell of turpentine. When the landlord at Red Lion Square told Deverell and Rossetti to ensure their models were kept under proper control, he was voicing an assumption that the entire neighbourhood shared, that artists and their models were, by nature, engaged in something disreputable, and that only constant vigilance could keep the baseness of passion from overwhelming the dignity of art. The young painters resented this. They were idealists. They wanted to paint beauty and truth, and the shimmering surface of the physical world, and they didn't want to seduce their models. And they wanted everyone to know they didn't want to seduce their models, which was itself a kind of anxious overperformance that only drew more attention to the possibility. So they avoided painting nudes. This was a deliberate choice, not an aesthetic one. The Royal Academy expected serious painters to study the nude figure. It was considered the highest test of artistic skill, the pinnacle of the tradition that stretched back through the Renaissance to the Greeks. But the Pre-Raphaelites, for the most part, sidestepped it. They painted women in elaborate costumes in medieval gowns, in flowing robes and headdresses and layers of historically researched fabric. They painted hair and hands and faces with extraordinary care, but they almost never painted bare skin below the collarbone. And the reason, beneath all the talk about artistic principle and historical authenticity, was simple. Painting a nude model required having a nude woman in your studio, and having a nude woman in your studio was the one thing, above all others, that the rules would not forgive. There's a practical joke from this period that I can't stop thinking about, because it captures the whole unstable, contradictory system in miniature. In the summer of 1850, Hunt and Stevens were visited in Hunt's studio by a friend named Jack Tupper. Lizzie was there, sitting for a painting, and for reasons that nobody has ever adequately explained, Hunt and Stevens told Tupper that Lizzie was Hunt's wife. Tupper believed them and treated her accordingly, with the deference and politeness that convention demanded toward a gentleman's wife, as opposed to the indifference or casual familiarity that convention allowed toward a hired model. When Gabriel found out, he was furious. He insisted that Hunt write to Tupper and apologise for the deception, because Tupper had wound up in a mortifying situation. He'd behaved toward a model as though she were a lady, and the humiliation of discovering the truth would, in Gabriel's view, be acute. The whole episode is almost impossible to unpack. Why did Hunt and Stevens do it? Was it a joke, a moment of idle mischief between young men who spent too much time in each other's company? Or was it something more revealing, a half-conscious test of what it would feel like to present Lizzie as a wife, to see how the world would treat her if the label were different? Did Lizzie know what they were doing? Did she participate? Or was she simply sitting in her costume holding her pose while the men in the room rearranged her social identity without consulting her? We don't know, but we know the prank worked, that Tupper couldn't tell the difference, that a model and a wife were, in the physical reality of the studio, indistinguishable. The only thing that separated them was the word, wife, model, and the entire architecture of Victorian propriety rested on that word, on the belief that the label was the truth, that what you called a woman determined what she was. And that, maybe, is the deepest rule of all. Not the chaperones, not the negotiations, not the approved lists and the careful letters and the mothers consulted on the Old Kent Road. The rule underneath all the other rules, that a woman's identity was not her own. It was assigned to her by the system she moved through, and it could be changed at any moment by the men who controlled that system. A model could be called a wife could be called a model. A lady could be stripped of her title by the simple fact of taking a job, and none of these transformations required her consent or even her knowledge. They happened around her, above her, in letters she never read, and conversations she was never part of, while she sat in a cold studio in a borrowed dress and held perfectly still. The evening settles over Chelsea. The studio is quiet, and somewhere, In a narrow passage off a London square, a young woman is walking home alone through streets where the rules say she shouldn't be, past shops and doorways and the soft yellow glow of gas lamps, carrying a shilling in her pocket and a reputation she didn't choose. But the rules didn't apply to the men the same way they applied to the women, and nobody pretended they did. Gabriel Rossetti was the most flagrant example, but he was far from the only one. When the Pre-Raphaelite circle descended on Oxford in the summer of 1857 to paint murals at the Union, the search for models became a kind of sport. Gabriel set the tone. He talked constantly about stunners, the word they used for beautiful women, turning physical attractiveness into a category, a collectible, something to be spotted and pursued like a rare butterfly. When a girl named Lipscomb caught someone's attention, her beauty was discussed and evaluated, and a painter was dispatched to try and recruit her. But the painter they sent was William Morris, who was hopeless at persuasion and had never mastered figure drawing, and the girl's mother, who was painfully aware, as one account put it, that her daughter's good looks attracted the attention of amorous undergraduates, sent him away. The mother saw what the painters were too busy being charming to acknowledge, that a request to model, however politely phrased, was a request for access to her daughter's body, and that granting it placed her daughter's future at the mercy of men whose intentions were, at best, ambiguous. The Lipscomb mother's refusal is one of my favourite moments in this whole story, because it's so ordinary and so clear. She didn't have a theory about gender or power or the exploitation of working-class women by middle-class artists. She simply knew that her daughter was pretty, and that pretty daughters in university towns needed protecting, and that a group of excitable young men asking to borrow her girl for an afternoon were, whatever they claimed about art and murals and the glory of medieval romance, not to be trusted with the thing they were asking for. She was right, of course. Not because the painters were wicked, mostly they weren't, but because the system in which they operated had no mechanism for holding them accountable if something went wrong. If a model's reputation was damaged, the model paid the price. If a painter behaved badly, his friends covered for him, and his career continued. The asymmetry was total, and the Lipscomb mother understood it instinctively, the way all mothers of pretty daughters understood it, without needing anyone to draw them a diagram. The painters, meanwhile, cheerfully broke their own rules whenever it suited them. Gabriel approached Jane Burden without an introduction, without a chaperone, without any of the formal procedures that the system demanded. He simply walked up to a stranger in a theatre and asked her to come to his rooms the next day, and if Allingham's approach to shopgirls in Cranbourne Alley constituted a sexual proposition, then Gabriel's approach to Jane at the Oxford Theatre was the same thing, dressed in different clothes. But Gabriel was Gabriel, charming, impulsive, supremely confident that the normal rules didn't apply to him, and what would have been scandalous from another man was merely eccentric from him. His friends indulged it, and the women he approached for the most part went along with it. And the rules, which had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of unmediated contact between men and women, bent around him like water around a stone. The difference always was power. The rules protected women who were already protected. Women with mothers, women with families, women whose social standing gave them the ability to say no and have the no respected. For women who lacked that standing, models, shopgirls, servants, the daughters of cobblers and washerwomen, the rules were less a protection than a description of their vulnerability. They told you what could happen to you, what people would assume about you. They told you the precise social cost of being alone in a room with a man who was paying you by the hour, and then they left you there, in the room, with the man and the money and the borrowed costume and expected you to manage the situation on your own. There's a word the Victorians used for women who managed the situation badly, a word that appears again and again in the letters and diaries and memoirs of this period, applied to models and shopgirls and any woman whose life intersected too visibly with the lives of men. The word was fallen, a fallen woman, as though respectability were a ledge and a woman's job was to keep her balance, and the moment she slipped, the moment she was seen alone with the wrong man, or heard to speak too freely, or known to have accepted money for the use of her body in any capacity, even one as innocent as holding still, she fell. And the fall was permanent. There was no climbing back up, no appeals process, no second chance, no mechanism for demonstrating that the fall had been misunderstood or misreported or that it had never happened at all. Once the word attached itself to you, it stuck, and your only options were concealment, reinvention, or acceptance. The models of the Pre-Raphaelite circle lived on that ledge every day. Some of them kept their balance, and some of them fell. And some of them, the quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones whose names appear once in a letter and then vanish, stepped down from the ledge on their own terms, walked away from the studios and the costumes and the shillings, and disappeared into ordinary lives that no one ever thought to record. The gas lamps are dimming and the street is almost empty, and the rules are still there, invisible and absolute, holding the world in place like the bones inside a body, felt in every movement, seen in none. Look at any painting from the Pre-Raphaelite circle. Really look at it the way you'd look at a face across a room, and you'll notice something. The women in these paintings don't speak. Their mouths are closed or barely parted. Their eyes are large and distant, fixed on something outside the frame that the viewer can never see. Their hands are passive, draped across a lap, trailing in water, holding a flower or a book with a looseness that suggests they might drop it at any moment and not notice. They exist in a state of permanent suspension, caught between one breath and the next, between waking and sleeping, between being looked at and being. They are, in the language of art criticism, idealized. In the language of this story, they are silenced. This is what the painters made of the women who sat for them. They took Lizzie, with her prominent eyelids and her gingery lashes, and her slightly protruding teeth, and her sharp, practical mind. And they turned her into Ophelia, into Delia, into Beatrice, into a dozen other women whose defining characteristic was that they felt everything and said nothing. They took Annie, streetwise, tough, able to read a room before anyone else in it had found their chair, and turned her into the guilt-struck kept woman of Hunt's most famous painting, frozen at the moment of realization, her face arranged to show the exact degree of moral clarity that the painter acquired. They took the real and made it ideal, took women who had opinions and turned them into women who had expressions. And then something stranger happened. The ideal leaked backward into life. The paintings became the truth, and the women behind them became the fiction. William Michael Rossetti didn't describe Lizzie as she was, a 20-year-old milliner's assistant with unfashionable red hair and a pragmatic eye for better wages. He described her as the paintings needed her to have been: 16, ladylike, possessed of instinctive refinement, a creature of maidenly purity who had somehow wandered into a bonnet shop by accident and was simply waiting to be discovered. Hunt didn't describe Annie as she was, a sharp, resourceful girl who'd survived poverty with her wits intact. He described her as a soul in peril, a beauty on the edge of the abyss, a subject who needed saving the same way his paintings needed finishing, with patience, with skill, with an unwavering belief that the final product would be worth the effort. The gap between canvas and life was widest and strangest in the case of Fanny Cornforth. Fanny was the one nobody wanted to talk about, the one who embarrassed everyone, the one who didn't fit the narrative no matter how hard you squeezed. She was, by her own admission and everyone else's observation, a professional prostitute. She'd grown up somewhere in Sussex. The details were deliberately vague, because Fanny herself kept rewriting them, changing her age, her birthplace, her father's occupation, her maiden name, with the casual confidence of a woman who understood that the past was something you could edit. Her real name was probably Sarah Cox, and by the time she crossed paths with the painter's world, around the winter of 1857 or 58, she was in her mid-20s, with a Cockney accent so thick you could lean on it, a mass of golden brown hair, and the broad, heavy-featured face that Gabriel would spend the next 2 decades drawing over and over again, turning her into the lush, sensual women of his later paintings. Women with swollen lips and heavy-lidded eyes. Women whose bodies took up the entire canvas. Women who radiated a physical presence so intense it bordered on threat. But here's the thing about Fanny that nobody at the time could bring themselves to say, and that Jan Marsh, writing a century later, was careful to acknowledge. Fanny was practical, cheerful, and entirely comfortable with who she was. She hadn't been seduced and abandoned. She hadn't fallen through innocence or ignorance. She'd weighed her options: domestic service, the needle trades, the grinding poverty of rural Sussex, and decided quite calmly that selling herself on the streets of London was a better life than scrubbing someone else's floors. This was not the story the Victorians wanted to hear about prostitution. The accepted version, the version promoted by moralists, novelists and charitable organisations alike, was that women became prostitutes through seduction, weakness, and despair, enjoyed a brief and gaudy period of prosperity, and then sank inevitably into degradation, disease, and death. Fanny's actual life contradicted this narrative at every point. She was doing fine, earning money, having a good time. And when she met Gabriel Rossetti, by her own account, at a public pleasure garden on a night of fireworks, where she broke a walnut with her teeth and tossed the shell in his direction, she entered his circle not as a victim to be pitied or a soul to be saved, but as a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and didn't particularly care whether anyone approved. She sat for Gabriel, slept with Gabriel. She moved into his life with a practicality that the other women in the circle, the careful, chaperoned, anxious about their reputations women, must have found bewildering. Fanny didn't worry about being seen. She didn't negotiate through mothers or require formal introductions. She wrapped her arms around George Boyce's neck while he sat at his easel, in a gesture of easy affection that would have been unthinkable for any woman who cared about the rules. Gabriel drew her in that embrace, both faces in profile, Fanny leaning forward from behind the chair, her arms clasped around Boyce, both of them looking at the canvas, the physical contact casual and secondary to the work. It's a remarkable drawing, because it shows something the other drawings in the Pre-Raphaelite archive almost never show. A woman who is comfortable. Not arranged, not posed, not performing stillness or suffering or spiritual transport. Just comfortable, in a room with men, touching one of them without ceremony, being herself. And of course everyone despised her for it. The Pre-Raphaelite circle tolerated Fanny because Gabriel wanted her there, but they never accepted her. She was too coarse, too loud, too unapologetically physical, and she didn't pretend to be refined or interested in poetry or painting, or the moral improvement of the working classes. She was interested in money and comfort and Gabriel's attention, and she said so, in an accent that made the educated men and women around her wince. They called her the elephant behind her back, a nickname that started as a private joke about her expanding figure and hardened, over the years, into a kind of permanent dismissal. She was the wrong kind of woman in the right kind of room, and nobody ever let her forget it. But Fanny had one quality that none of the other women in this story possessed. The quality I keep coming back to late at night when the rest of the tale has gone quiet. She never pretended to be someone she wasn't. Lizzie was forced to perform gentility. Annie was coerced into performing class transformation. Emma Hill spent her life inside a fabricated biography. Jane Burden, when she married William Morris, stepped into a social role so far above her origins that she spent decades learning how not to betray herself. Every one of them, in one way or another, was performing, playing a part, wearing a version of themselves that someone else had designed. Fanny never wore a costume she hadn't chosen. She was who she was, a former prostitute from Sussex with a Cockney accent and a taste for nice things, and she walked into every room announcing that fact, not with words, but with the sheer unapologetic weight of her presence. The painters could despise her, the wives look down on her, the biographers dismiss her, but they couldn't erase her, because she'd never given them a fictional version to replace. And that, I think, is the deepest irony of the whole Pre-Raphaelite model story. The woman who was most herself, most honest, most unedited, most stubbornly real, was the one the world judged most harshly. And the women most thoroughly rewritten. Lizzie made ethereal, Annie made cautionary, Emma made rural and innocent, were the ones the world agreed to call beautiful. Meanwhile, Hunt was trying to erase Annie from her own past. In January of 1858, he went to George Boyce's studio with an extraordinary request. He was planning, he said, to marry Annie once her education was complete, and he wanted to destroy all evidence that she had ever been a model. Boyce owned a drawing of Annie, a direct study of her head, done from life, showing her as she actually looked. Hunt asked Boyce to surrender it, in a request that was polite but intense, and at first Boyce, who was fond of Annie and proud of his drawing, resisted. But Hunt pressed, explaining that keeping the portrait could interfere, even indirectly, with his plans for Annie's future. The drawing was evidence. It proved she had sat alone with a man in his studio, and a woman who had done that could not, by the rules that governed Hunt's world, become a gentleman's wife, unless the evidence was removed. Boyce gave in and handed over the drawing, and in that small, quiet transaction, one man asking another to surrender a picture of a woman, so that the woman could be unmade and remade according to the first man's design, the whole story reaches its strangest point. The gap between canvas and life wasn't just a matter of artistic interpretation, it was a program, a deliberate project of erasure, in which the real woman was to be systematically removed from the record and replaced with a version that the world would find acceptable. Hunt wasn't just painting over Annie's face the way he'd painted over Lizzie's in the Sylvia portrait. He was trying to paint over her life. It didn't work, of course. Within weeks, Hunt changed his mind about the marriage, and Annie, freed at last from the improvement project, went her own way, married someone else, lived a life that bore no resemblance to anything the painters had planned for her, and disappeared from the Pre-Raphaelite story so completely that for decades she was remembered only as a footnote, the ungrateful girl, the one who couldn't be saved. But there's another side to this gap between canvas and life that deserves attention, because it involves the one woman who refused to stay on the model's side of the easel. Lizzie didn't just sit for paintings, she made them. By 1852 she was drawing, awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence, using the materials Gabriel left lying around his studio and the techniques she'd absorbed by watching painters work from the other side of the pose. Nobody had taught her formally. She had no training, no schooling in perspective or anatomy, no access to the life classes and subscription clubs where male artists honed their skills. She learned by proximity, the way a child learns language, by being immersed in it, by hearing it spoken around her every day, by picking up the grammar through sheer exposure. Gabriel noticed. He encouraged her, which was generous and also self-serving, because a model who drew was more interesting than a model who didn't, and a woman with artistic ambitions was easier to present to the world as something other than a hired body. But the encouragement was real. He praised her work to his friends and told his sister Christina that Lizzie showed genuine promise. And at some point during those early years of drawing and posing and falling in love and trying to figure out what she was allowed to want, Lizzie made a complaint that has survived because it was so unusual and so contrary to everything the studio system assumed about its women. She said that nobody cared about her soul. That phrase sits there in the historical record like a small explosion. Nobody cared about her soul, the part of her that thought and felt and wanted things for herself, the part that the paintings never showed, because paintings couldn't show it, and the painters, for all their talk about truth and beauty and the faithful rendering of the visible world, had never thought to look for it. They looked at her body. They studied the fall of light across her skin. They noted the particular quality of her expression and transferred it onto canvas with extraordinary skill. But the person behind the expression, the woman who was tired of holding still, who wanted to make something of her own, who felt the injustice of being treated as a surface without a depth, that person was invisible to them, or if not invisible, then irrelevant. Because the painting was what mattered. The model was equipment. Lizzie's drawing was her answer to that invisibility. She couldn't change the system she was in, or make the painters see her as a person rather than a pose. But she could pick up a pencil and make something that was hers, something that came from her own eye and her own hand and her own way of seeing the world, not from someone else's arrangement of her body in a borrowed dress. Her subjects were modest, small watercolours of medieval and literary scenes, done in the style she'd absorbed from the Pre-Raphaelite circle, but with a quietness and a simplicity that were distinctly her own. They weren't masterpieces, weren't meant to be. They were proof. Proof that the woman behind the paintings existed. Proof that she had an eye and a mind and something to say. Proof that she was more than a shape in cold light. And this is where the gap between canvas and life becomes something almost unbearable. Because Lizzie's drawings were judged inevitably by the men who had been painting her. Gabriel himself was more generous than most, but his generosity was wrapped in a possessiveness that made it hard to tell where the encouragement ended and the control began. He promoted her work to Ruskin, arranged for her to receive the stipend, told his friends she had talent. But he also managed her career as though it were an extension of his own, deciding who should see her drawings and under what circumstances, steering her towards subjects and styles he approved of, treating her artistic development as a project he was supervising rather than a journey she was making on her own. The model had become a painter, but the painter was still being managed, still being positioned, still being told where to stand and how to hold the brush. There's a drawing of Lizzie at her easel, done by Gabriel, that shows her concentrating on her work, head bent, hand steady, completely absorbed. It's one of the few images in the whole Pre-Raphaelite archive that shows a woman making art rather than being made into it. And the fact that this image was drawn by the man who was simultaneously painting her, managing her, and falling in love with her, gives it a complexity that no amount of analysis can resolve. He saw her as a painter, and also as a model, as a woman with a soul that nobody cared about, and also as a surface on which he could project his own ideas about beauty and longing and the particular shade of red gold that her hair turned in north light. He saw all of these things at once, and the paintings he made of her, the ones that hang in galleries now, the ones that schoolchildren are taught to admire, show only the last of them. The surface, the colour, the hair. The night is very quiet now, and in a studio somewhere, it doesn't matter which one, they're all the same in the dark, a painting is drying on its stretcher, and the woman it was made from is somewhere else entirely, living a life the painting knows nothing about. What do you do after someone has spent years looking at you and deciding what you mean? What do you do when the painting is finished and the painter has moved on, and the costume has been folded and put back in its trunk, and you're standing in the street outside the studio in your own clothes, with a shilling in your pocket and a face that belongs to a dozen canvases you'll never own? You could do what most of them did. You could disappear, go back to the bonnet shop or the kitchen or the laundry, back to the life you'd stepped out of when a painter noticed your cheekbones, and you could live out your years in the kind of quiet that history doesn't record. Most models did exactly that. Sat and posed and collected their pay, and then they vanished into the vast, undocumented ordinary of Victorian working life, leaving behind nothing but a face on a canvas and a name, sometimes not even a name, in someone else's letter. But the three women at the centre of this story didn't disappear. They stayed, each in her own way, and each of them did something with the position she'd been placed in, not the position the painters imagined for her, but the position she actually occupied, which was harder and stranger and less romantic than anyone wanted to admit. Lizzie drew, that was her answer, and it was the most radical thing any of them did, because it meant refusing to stay on the model's side of the easel. By the mid-1850s, she was producing her own watercolours, small, quiet pictures of medieval subjects, done in the Pre-Raphaelite style she'd absorbed through years of watching from the other side of the pose. She enrolled in art classes in Sheffield during a stay with relatives and showed her work to Ruskin, who liked it enough to offer her an income. She was, for a brief window of years, something the Victorian art world had almost no language for. A woman who had been a model and was now an artist, who had been looked at and was now looking, who had been the object of other people's creativity and was now the subject of her own. It would be satisfying to say that her art freed her. It would make a better story, but the truth is more complicated and less kind. Gabriel encouraged her drawing, but he also managed it, directing her towards subjects he approved of, controlling who saw her work, treating her development as a subsidiary branch of his own career. Ruskin's stipend gave her financial independence, but Ruskin's opinions about where she should live, what she should eat, whether she should travel, came with the money, wrapping her in a new set of obligations that replaced the old ones without fundamentally changing the structure. She was still being managed, still being positioned. The easel was in her hands now, but the hands around the easel were still someone else's. She and Gabriel married in 1860, after a courtship so long and so interrupted by illness, separation, and mutual uncertainty that it had become a kind of permanent condition rather than a progression toward anything. The marriage was fragile from the start, burdened by Liz's failing health, by Gabriel's wandering attention, by the accumulated weight of a decade spent in each other's company, without ever quite arriving at the destination both of them had been promised. She gave birth to a stillborn daughter, and took laudanum for the pain, and then for the sadness, and then for reasons that nobody could name. And then, in February of 1862, less than 2 years after the wedding, she was gone. The circumstances were ambiguous. The coroner recorded an accidental overdose. The people who knew her weren't sure, and Gabriel, consumed by grief and guilt, placed the only manuscript copy of his poems in her coffin, a gesture so theatrical, so perfectly calibrated to the Pre-Raphaelite sensibility, that it's hard to know whether it was an act of love or an act of composition. He was, even in that moment, making a picture. But there's something I want to say about Lizzie that has nothing to do with how she died. It has to do with the fact that she tried. She tried to be more than a model, more than a muse, more than a face on a canvas. She picked up a brush and made things, and those things still exist, hanging in museums, catalogued and studied, attributed to Elizabeth Siddal rather than to the men who painted her. That matters, because in a world that wanted her to hold still and be quiet and let other people decide what she meant, she made something that spoke in her own voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't revolutionary, but it was hers. Annie's answer was different, and in some ways simpler, and in some ways braver. She left. When Hunt finally came home from the Holy Land and the engagement collapsed, worn down by his controlling demands, by the endless reports from Stevens, by the whole suffocating machinery of improvement, Annie walked away. No scene, no manifesto. She simply stopped playing the part she'd been assigned and went back to being herself, which was the one thing the entire improvement project had been designed to prevent. She married a man named Captain Thompson, an army officer, a gentleman by rank if not by birth. A man who apparently didn't care that his wife had once sat in painters' studios in borrowed costumes and been the subject of elaborate schemes of moral rescue. They had daughters and lived quietly, first in London and then in Shoreham-by-Sea, a small fishing port on the Sussex coast. Annie wore beautifully crafted shoes and fine leather gloves. A woman who knew her daughter later recalled her as lovely and ladylike. The distance between Cross Keys Court and that carriage was almost immeasurable. And here's the detail that makes me catch my breath. Hunt met her once more years later by accident on Richmond Hill. She was riding in a carriage surrounded by children. They greeted each other politely, exchanged news the way old acquaintances do when neither wants to revisit the past, and afterward, Hunt told a friend that he had forgiven Annie for her so-called transgression against him. He'd decided, on long reflection, that the whole business had actually turned out for his benefit rather than his injury. What Annie thought about being forgiven was never written down. Of course it wasn't. Annie's response was never recorded. That was the whole point of her story, from the beginning to the end, that her voice was always the one missing from the conversation, her opinion always the one nobody thought to ask for, her version always the one that went unwritten while the men around her produced letters and diaries and memoirs and biographies that told the story their way. Hunt forgave her. What a sentence. What a breathtaking piece of self-regard. He forgave her for not wanting to be remade in his image, for not being grateful enough for the improvement he'd imposed on her, for having the temerity to live her own life according to her own judgment rather than his. And he said it publicly, as though his forgiveness were a gift she should have wanted. Annie lived to 90. She was the last of all these women to leave the world, outlasting them all, the painters, the wives, the muses, the models. She died in 1925 in Shoreham, nearly 70 years after Hunt had first spotted her in the streets of Chelsea and decided she needed saving. 70 years. A whole life lived in the space the painters couldn't see. And Fanny. Fanny, who never pretended, who never performed, who walked into rooms with her Cockney accent and her cheerful appetite, and her absolute refusal to be anyone other than who she was. Fanny stayed. She was the one who was there when Gabriel's health collapsed, when his mind darkened, when the laudanum and the chloral took hold, and the brilliant young painter who'd once charmed everyone in London became a paranoid, reclusive, fading figure behind the curtains at Cheyne Walk. The respectable women had moved on. Lizzie was gone. Jane Morris, whom Gabriel had loved with an intensity that frightened them both, had returned to her husband. The friends had drifted away. But Fanny was still there in her practical, unchivalric way, doing the work that nobody else wanted to do. Feeding him, managing the household, dealing with the creditors and the doctors and the long, terrible evenings when the drugs wore off and the paranoia set in, and the man who had once been the most charming person in any room became someone who couldn't bear to leave his own. She wasn't gentle about it, wasn't poetic. She was practical, the way she had always been practical. A woman who understood that someone had to keep the house running and make sure there was food on the table and coal in the grate, and since nobody else was volunteering, it might as well be her. The biographers would later treat her presence in Gabriel's final years as a sign of his degradation. Proof that a great artist had fallen so low he could only be tended by a former prostitute. But you could read it another way. You could read it as evidence that Fanny was the only person in his life who never needed him to be anything other than what he was. After Gabriel died in 1882, Fanny married a man named John Shott, and tried, briefly and unsuccessfully, to profit from her connection to the great painter. She and Schott opened something they called the Rossetti Gallery in Old Bond Street, exhibiting Gabriel's pictures, which outraged William Michael and the family and confirmed every unkind thing anyone had ever said about Fanny's motives. But the gallery didn't last, and neither did the money. Schott died and the allowance shrank. As the new century turned, Fanny was approaching 70. Her mind was failing, and the world that had once tolerated her because Gabriel wanted her around had no further use for her. She ended her days in Brighton in 1905, in the kind of quiet obscurity that the Victorians reserved for women whose stories didn't end the way they were supposed to. 3 women. 3 answers to the same question. What do you do when someone else has decided what you mean? Lizzie picked up a brush and tried to mean something of her own. Annie walked away and built a life the painters couldn't see, and Fanny stayed exactly where she was and refused to pretend she was anywhere else. None of them won, exactly, and none of them escaped the system they'd been born into, the system that measured their value in shillings and poses and the angle of light on skin. But none of them were only what the paintings made them either. Behind every canvas, behind every silent, idealised, perfectly arranged face, there was a woman with cold feet and a sore back and a life to get on with. And that life, the one the paintings don't show, the one the letters barely mention, the one that happened in the hours between sittings, in the streets between studios, in the rooms where nobody was watching, that life was theirs. The last lamp goes out, the studios are dark, and somewhere in the quiet that settles over a sleeping city, 3 women are lying in 3 different beds, in 3 different parts of London, breathing slowly, dreaming of things that have nothing to do with art. But before I let this story settle into silence, there's something I want to say about all of them together. Not as individuals, not as case studies, but as a pattern. Because the pattern is the thing that matters, the thing that outlasted all of them, the thing that's still here now, in the way we tell stories about women and art and the complicated, unequal transactions between the person who holds the brush and the person who holds the pose. Every one of these women was found. That's the word the record uses. Found, discovered, spotted, noticed. As though they'd been hiding. As though they'd been waiting in their bonnet shops and slum courtyards and theatre galleries for the right man to come along and see them, the way a gemstone waits in the earth for someone to dig it up. The language of discovery puts the power entirely in the hands of the discoverer. It makes the painter the active figure, the one who seeks, who finds, who recognises value where others see nothing. And it makes the model passive, the one found, chosen, existing in a state of latent potential until someone else's eye activates her. But that's not what happened. Lizzie didn't wait to be discovered. She was working in a bonnet shop, earning a living, getting on with her life. The discovery was something that happened to her, not something she'd been waiting for, and Annie didn't wait to be rescued. She was a girl in a courtyard playing with the neighbours' children, surviving the way poor children survive, by being tough and quick and not asking anyone's permission. The rescue was Hunt's idea, not hers, and Fanny didn't wait to be anything. She threw a nutshell at a stranger and walked into his life as though she owned it, because in a sense she did. She owned herself in a way that none of the other women in this story quite managed, and the price of that ownership was that nobody ever forgave her for it. The paintings remain. That's the obvious thing to say, and it's true and it matters. The paintings are in museums now. Ophelia at the Tate, The Awakening Conscience at the Tate, Gabriel's drawings and watercolours scattered across collections around the world. People stand in front of them and feel things. People write books about them and teach classes about them and reproduce them on postcards and coffee mugs and the covers of novels. The paintings are permanent, or as close to permanent as anything made by human hands, and the women behind them, the women who held the poses, who wore the costumes, who lay in the cold water and sat through the long afternoons and walked home through the London streets with a shilling in their pockets. Those women are gone. Their voices are gone, and their versions of the story with them. What remains is the painted version. The version that was made by someone else. The version that shows what the painter saw and not what the model felt. But the record isn't quite as empty as it seems. Jan Marsh's book, the book this story has been built on, was an act of excavation. Marsh dug through the letters and the diaries and the memoirs and the census records and the wills and the grave plots, looking for the women underneath the paint. She found them, not completely. There are gaps, silences, whole years unaccounted for. But she found enough to reconstruct something real, something that resists the idealised versions, something that puts the cold water back in the bathtub and the lice back in Annie's hair, and the cockney back in Fanny's voice. She found the women behind the women in the paintings, and she let them be imperfect and specific and alive. And maybe that's the thing worth holding on to as this evening draws to its close. Not the paintings, beautiful as they are. Not the painters, gifted as they were. But the women themselves, in all their stubborn, complicated, unidealised reality. Lizzie with her prominent eyelids and her quiet ambition, and her refusal to be only what other people needed her to be. Annie with her street sharpness and her beautiful shoes and her long, unrecorded life in a seaside town. Fanny with her cockney accent and her nutshells and her absolute, infuriating, magnificent refusal to apologise for a single thing. They weren't muses, weren't tragic heroines, weren't symbols of anything. They were women who sat in cold rooms in borrowed clothes and held perfectly still while someone else decided what they meant. And then they got up and put on their own coats and walked out into the world and lived. The city is quiet now. The paintings are sleeping in their galleries, behind glass, in temperature-controlled rooms where the air is carefully managed and the light never changes. And somewhere, in the dark, the women they were made from are finally completely at rest. So here we are, at the end of a long evening spent in rooms that smelled of linseed oil and turpentine, in the company of women whose faces we know better than their names. We've stood beside them in bonnet shops and slum courtyards, watched them hold still in borrowed costumes while someone across the easel decided what their mouths should mean. We've felt the weight of cold water around a body that wasn't allowed to move. We've watched paintings dry on their stretchers, and we've watched the women who made those paintings possible walk out into lives that the paintings will never show. And now, lying here in your own warmth, in your own bed, in whatever corner of the world you're listening from tonight, you're a long way from Victorian London. The gas lamps are out, the studios are empty, the costumes folded in trunks that nobody will open again. But something from those rooms has followed you here, I think. Something quiet, something that doesn't need a name. The feeling of what it's like to be looked at without being seen. The feeling of holding still when every part of you wants to move. The feeling of being useful to someone else's vision and invisible to your own. Those feelings aren't Victorian. They don't belong to a particular century or a particular kind of woman. They belong to anyone who has ever stood in a room and wondered whether the person looking at them was seeing them or seeing something else entirely. I don't know which of these women you'll think about tomorrow, if you think about any of them at all. Maybe Lizzie, lying in the cold water, not saying a word. Maybe Annie, sitting in a rented room in a nightgown that wasn't hers, while a man she barely knew decided what her face should mean. Maybe Fanny, throwing a nutshell at a stranger and refusing ever afterward to apologise for it. Or maybe none of them. Maybe just the quiet, ordinary fact that behind every famous painting there's a body, and behind every body there's a person, and behind every person there's a life that the painting knows nothing about. If any of that stayed with you tonight, if something in this story made you think of a face you've seen in a gallery, or a question you hadn't thought to ask, I'd love to hear about it. You can leave a word or two below whenever you like. There's no rush. It can wait until morning, or it can wait until the next time you pass a painting and find yourself wondering about the woman inside it. This is boring history for sleep, and we'll be here. We're building this slowly, one evening at a time. Stories from medieval England, from ancient Rome, from the kitchens and courtyards and quiet rooms of centuries you've never visited. If tonight felt like a good place to rest, you're warmly welcome to subscribe, so that another evening like this one is waiting whenever you need it. And if you'd rather just drift off and forget about it, that's fine too. None of it asks anything of you now. For now, there is only this. The warmth around you, the weight of the blankets, the slow, easy breathing of a body that has nowhere else it needs to be. The paintings are sleeping in their galleries, the women behind them are at rest, and so, very gently are you. Sleep well.